Hello from the underground. Thank you for returning. We're going to finish Dostoyevsky's Notes from Underground. The second and final part is a recollection of the narrator's history. The narrator who we learned so much about in the last section. Positive qualities that we should bear in mind as we continue his story, being that he is inconsistent, but he acknowledges the myriad components that make up the soul of a man, the positivistic elements teeming in him, not necessarily an excuse for being inconsistent and a liar, but certainly part of the riddle therein, and something that we can definitely, I feel, appreciate as a truism about ourselves. You're a liar. I'm a liar. I have had moments in my life of utterly disorganized psychic components, psyche, subconscious elements, always at feud with one another. And if nothing else, Dostoyevsky's Notes from Underground is a wonderful study into what might become a man who exults in these contradictions rather than attempts to harness and perfect them. Well, we'll finish the book now, and we'll see exactly where this character takes us. Part 2. Apropos of the wet snow. When from the gloom of corruption I delivered your fallen soul with the ardent speech of conviction, and, full of profound torment, wringing your hands, you cursed the vice that ensnared you. When, with memory's punishing, forgetful conscience, you told me the tale of all that had happened before me, and suddenly, covering your face, full of shame and horror, you tearfully resolved, outraged, shocked, etc., etc., etc. From the poetry of N.A. Nekrasov. Part 1. At that time, I was only 24. My life was even then gloomy, disorganized, and solitary to the point of savagery. I made friends with no one, and even avoided talking, and hid myself in my corner more and more. At work in the office, I even tried never to look at anyone, and I was very well aware that my colleagues looked upon me, not only as a crank, but looked upon me, so I always thought, seemed to look upon me with a sort of loathing. I sometimes wondered why no one except me thought that he was looked upon with loathing. One of our clerks had a repulsive, pock-marked face, which even looked villainous. I believed I would not have dared to look at anyone with such an unsightly face. Another had a uniform so worn that there was an unpleasant smell near him. Yet not one of these gentlemen was disconcerted either by his clothes, or his face, or in some moral sense. Neither of them imagined that he was looked at with loathing, and even if he had imagined it, it would not have mattered to him, so long as his superiors did not look at him in that way. It is perfectly clear to me now that, owing to my unbounded vanity and probably to the high standard I set for myself, I very often looked at myself with furious discontent, which verged on loathing, and so I inwardly attributed the same view to everyone. For instance, I hated my face. I thought it disgusting, and even suspected that there was something base in its expression, and therefore every time I turned up at the office, I painfully tried to behave as independently as possible, so that I might not be suspected of being base, and so give my face as noble an expression as possible. Let my face even be ugly, I thought, but let it be noble, expressive, and above all, extremely intelligent. But I was absolutely and painfully certain that my face could never express these perfections. But what was worse of all, I thought it positively stupid looking, and I would have been quite satisfied if I could have looked intelligent. In fact, I would have even put up with looking base if at the same time my face could have been thought terribly intelligent. Of course, I hated my fellow clerks, one and all, and I despised them all, yet at the same time I was, as it were, afraid of them. It happened at times that I even thought more highly of them than of myself. It somehow happened quite suddenly, then that if I alternated between despising them and thinking them superior to myself, a cultivated and decent man cannot be vain without setting an inordinately high standard for himself, and without despising himself at certain moments to the point of hatred. But whether I despised them or thought them superior, I dropped my eyes almost every time I met anyone. I even made experiments whether I could face so-and-so's looking at me, and I was always the first to drop my eyes. This tormented me to the point of frenzy. I was also morbidly afraid of being ridiculous, and so I slavishly worshipped the conventional and everything external. I loved to fall into the common rut, and had a wholehearted terror of any kind of eccentricity in myself. But how could I live up to it? I was morbidly cultivated, as a cultivated man of our age should be. They were all dull, and as like one another as so many sheep. Perhaps I was the only one in the office who constantly thought that I was a coward and a slave, and I thought it precisely because I was cultivated. But I did not only think it in actuality, it was really so. I was a coward and a slave. I say this without the slightest embarrassment. Every decent man in our age must be a coward and a slave. That is his normal condition. I am profoundly convinced of that. He is made that way and is constructed for that very purpose. And not only at the present time owing to some casual circumstances, but always, at all times, a decent man must be a coward and a slave. That is the law of nature for all decent people on earth. If any of them happens to be brave about something, he need not be comforted or carried away by that. He will funk out just the same before something else. That is how it invariably and inevitably ends. Only asses and mules are brave, and even they are so only until they come up against the wall. It is not even worthwhile to pay attention to them, because they don't mean anything at all. Still another circumstance tormented me in those days, that no one resembled me, and that I resembled no one else. I am alone, and they are everyone, I thought and pondered. From that it can be seen that I was still an absolute child. The very opposite sometimes happened. After all, how vile it sometimes seemed to have to go to the office. Things reached such a point that I often came home ill. But all at once, for no rhyme or reason, there would come a phase of skepticism and indifference. Everything happened to me in phases, and I would myself laugh at my intolerance and fastidiousness. I would reproach myself with being romantic. Sometimes I was unwilling to speak to anyone, while at other times I would not only talk, but even think of forming a friendship with them. All my fastidiousness would suddenly vanish, for no rhyme or reason. Who knows? Perhaps I never really had it, and it had simply been affected and gotten out of books. I've still not decided that question even now. Once I quite made friends with them, visited their homes, played preferences, drank vodka, talked of promotions. But here, let me make a digression. We Russians, speaking generally, have never had those foolish transcendental German and still more French romantics on whom nothing produces any effect. If there were an earthquake, if all France perished at the barricades, they would still be the same. They would not even change for decency's sake, but would still go on singing their transcendental songs, so to speak, to the hour of their death, because they are fools. We in Russia have no fools. That is well known. That is what distinguishes us from foreign lands. Consequently, those transcendental natures do not exist among us in their pure forms. We only think they do because our positivistic journalists and critics at the time, always on the hunt for Constant Zoglos or Uncle Peter Ivanitch, and foolishly accepting them as our ideals, slandered our romantics, taking them for the same transcendental sort that exists in Germany or France. On the contrary, the characteristics of our romantics are absolutely and directly opposed to the transcendental European types, and not a single European standard can be applied to them. Allow me to make use of the word romantic, an old-fashioned and much-respected word which has done good service and is familiar to all. The characteristics of our romantics are to understand everything, to see everything, and often to see it incomparably more clearly than our most positivistic minds see it, to refuse to accept anyone or anything, but at the same time not to despise anything, to give away, to yield from policy, never to lose sight of a useful practical goal, such as a rent-free government quarters, pensions, decorations, to keep their eye on that object through all the enthusiasms and volumes of lyrical poems, and at the same time to preserve the sublime and the beautiful, inviolate within them to the hour of their death, and so, incidentally, to preserve themselves wrapped in cotton like some precious jewel, if only for the benefit of the sublime and the beautiful. Our romantic is a man of great breadth, and the greatest rogue of all our rogues, I assure you. I can even assure you from experience. Of course, all that occurs if he is intelligent. But what am I saying? The romantic is always intelligent, and I only meant to observe that although we have had foolish romantics, they don't count, and they were only so because in the flower of their youth they degenerated completely into Germans, and to preserve their precious jewel more comfortably settled somewhere out there by preference of Weimar or the Black Forest. I, for instance, genuinely despised my official work and did not openly abuse it simply through necessity, because I was in it myself and got a salary for it. And as a result, take note, I did not openly abuse it. Our romantic would rather go out of his mind, which incidentally happened very rarely, than abuse it unless he had some other career in view, and he is never kicked out, unless, of course, he is taken to the lunatic asylum as the King of Spain, and then only if he went very mad. But after all, it is only the thin, fair people who go out of their minds in Russia. Innumerable romantics later in life rise to considerable rank in the service. Their versatility is remarkable, and what a faculty they have for the most contradictory sensations. I was comforted by those thoughts, even in those days, and am so still. That is why there are so many broad natures among us who never lose their ideal, even in the depths of degradation. And though they never lift a finger for their ideal, though they are errant thieves and robbers, yet they tearfully cherish their first ideal and are extraordinarily honest at heart. Yet only among us can the most errant rogue be absolutely and even loftily honest at heart without in the least ceasing to be a rogue. I repeat, our romantics, after all, frequently become such accomplished rascals. I use the term rascals affectionately, suddenly display such a sense of reality and practical knowledge that their bewildered superiors and the public can only gape in amazement at them. Their many-sidedness is really astounding, and goodness know what it may turn itself into under future circumstances, and what lies in store for us later on. They are good stuff. I do not say this out of any foolish or boastful patriotism, but I feel sure that you are again imagining that I am joking, or perhaps it's just the contrary, and you are convinced that I really think so. Anyway, gentlemen, I shall welcome both views as an honor and a special favor, and do forgive my digression. I did not, of course, maintain a friendship with my comrades, and soon was at loggerheads with them, and in my youthful inexperience I even gave up bowing to them, as though I had cut off all relations. That, however, only happened to me once. As a rule, I was always alone. In the first place, at home, I spent most of my time reading. I tried to stifle all that was continually seething within me by means of external sensations, and the only source of external sensation possible for me was reading. Reading was a great help, of course. It excited, delighted, and tormented me, but at times it bored me terribly. One longed for movement just the same, and I plunged all at once into dark, subterranean, loathsome, not vice, but petty vice. My petty passions were acute, smarting from my continual sticky irritability. I had hysterical fits, with tears and convulsions. I had no resource except reading. That is, there was then nothing in my surroundings which I could respect and which even attracted me. I was overwhelmed with depression, too. I had a hysterical craving for contradictions and for contrast, and so I took to vice. I have not said all this to justify myself, after all, but no, I am lying. I did not want to justify myself. I make that little observation for my own benefit, gentlemen. I don't want to lie. I vowed to myself I would not. I indulged my vice in solitude at night, furtively, timidly, filthily, and with a feeling of shame which never deserted me, even at the most loathsome moments, and which at such moments drove me to curses. Even then I already had the underground in my soul. I was terribly afraid of being seen, of being met, of being recognized. I visited various completely obscure places. One night, as I was passing a tavern, I saw through a lighted window some gentlemen fighting with billiard cues, and saw one of them thrown out of the window. At another time, I would have felt very much disgusted. But then I was suddenly in such a mood that I actually envied the gentleman thrown out of the window, and I envied him so much that I even went into the tavern and into the billiard room. Perhaps, I thought, I'll have a fight too, and they'll throw me out the window. I was not drunk, but what is one to do? After all, depression will drive a man to such a pitch of hysteria. But nothing happened. It seemed that I was not even equal to being thrown out of a window, and I went away without having fought. An officer put me in my place from the very first moment. I was standing by the billiard table in my ignorance, blocking up the way, and he wanted to pass. He took me by the shoulders and without a word, without a warning or an explanation, moved me from where I was standing to another spot and passed by as though he had not noticed me. I could have forgiven blows, but I absolutely could not forgive his having moved me and so completely failing to notice me. Devil knows what I would have given for a real, regular quarrel, a more decent, a more literary one, so to speak. I had been treated like a fly. This officer was over 6 feet, while I am short and thin. But the quarrel was in my hands. I had only to protest, and I had only to protest, and I certainly would have been thrown out of the window. But I changed my mind and preferred to beat a resentful retreat. I went out of the tavern straight home, confused and troubled, and the next night I continued with my petty vices, still more furtively, abjectly, and miserably than before, as it were, with tears in my eyes. But still, I did continue them. Don't imagine, though, that I funked out on the officer through cowardice. I have never been a coward at heart, though I have always been a coward in action. Don't be in a hurry to laugh. There is an explanation for it. I have an explanation for everything, you may be sure. Ah, if only that officer had been one of the sort who would consent to fight a duel, but no. He was one of those gentlemen, alas, long extinct, who preferred fighting with cues, or like Gogol's Lieutenant Perigov, appealing to the police. They did not fight duels, and would have thought a duel with a civilian like me an utterly unseemly procedure in any case, and they looked upon the duel altogether as something impossible, something free-thinking and French, and they were quite ready to insult people, especially when they were over 6 feet. I did not funk out through cowardice here, but through unbounded vanity. I was not afraid of his 6 feet, not of getting a sound thrashing and being thrown out the window. I would probably have been sufficient physical courage, but I lacked sufficient moral courage. What I was afraid of was that everyone present, from the insolent marker down to the lowest little stinking pimply clerk hanging around in a greasy collar, would jeer at me and fail to understand when I began to protest and how to address them in literary language. For even now we cannot, after all, speak of the point of honor, not of honor, but of the point of honor, point d'honneur. Except in literary language, you cannot allude to the point of honor in ordinary language. I was fully convinced, the sense of reality, in spite of all romanticism, that they would all simply split their sides with laughter, and that the officer would not simply, that is, not uninsultingly, beat me, but would certainly prod me in the back with his knee, kick me around the billiard table this way, and only then perhaps have pity and throw me out of the window. Of course, this trivial incident could not have ended like that with me. I often met that officer afterwards in the street and observed him very carefully. I am not quite sure whether he recognized me. I imagine not, I judge from certain signs, but I stared at him with spite and hatred, and so it went on. For several years. My resentment even grew deeper with the years. At first I began making stealthy inquiries about this officer. It was difficult for me to do so, for I knew no one. But one day I heard someone call him by his name on the street when I was following him at a distance, just as though I was tied to him, and so I learned his surname. Another time I followed him to his flat, and for a few pennies learned from the porter where he lived, on which floor, whether he lived alone or with others, and so on. In fact, everything one could learn from a porter. One morning, though I had never tried to write before anything, it suddenly occurred to me to describe this officer in the form of an exposé, in a satire, in a tale. I wrote the tale with relish. I did expose him. I slandered him. At first I so altered his name so that it could be easily recognized, but on a second thought I changed it, and sent the story to the annals of the fatherland. But at that time, such exposés were not yet in the fashion, and my story was not printed. That was a great vexation to me. Sometimes I was positively choked with resentment. At last I decided to challenge my enemy to a duel. I composed a splendid, charming letter to him, imploring him to apologize to me, and hinted rather plainly at a duel in case of refusal. The letter was so composed that if the officer had had the least understanding of the sublime and the beautiful, he would certainly have rushed to me to fling himself on my neck and to offer me his friendship. And how fine that would have been! How we would have gotten along! How we would have gotten along! He could have shielded me with his higher rank, while I could have improved his mind with my culture, and, well, my ideas, and all sorts of things might have happened. Just think, this was 2 years after his insult to me, and my challenge was the most ridiculous anachronism, in spite of all the ingenuity of my letter in disguising and explaining away the anachronism. But thank God, to this day I thank the Almighty with tears in my eyes, I did not send the letter to him. Cold shivers run down my back when I think of what might have happened if I had sent it, and all at once I revenged myself in the simplest way, by a stroke of genius. A brilliant thought suddenly dawned upon me. Sometimes on holidays I used to stroll along the sunny side of the Nevsky between 3 and 4 in the afternoon. That is, I did not stroll so much as experience innumerable torments, humiliations, and resentments. But no doubt that it was just what I wanted. I used to wriggle like an eel among the passerbys in the most unbecoming fashion, continually moving aside to make way for generals, for officers of the guards and the hussars, for the ladies. In those minutes, I used to feel a convulsive twinge at my heart, and hot all the way down my back at the mere thought of the wretchedness of my dress, of the wretchedness and vulgarity of my little wriggling figure. This was a regular martyrdom, a continual, intolerable humiliation at the thought, which passed into an insistent and direct sensation that I was a fly in the eyes of this whole world, a nasty, disgusting fly, more intelligent, more cultivated, more noble than any of them, of course, but a fly that was continually making way for everyone, insulted and humiliated by everyone. Why I inflicted this torment upon myself, why I went to the Nevsky, I don't know. I felt simply drawn there at every opportunity. Already then I began to experience a rush of the enjoyment of which I spoke in the first chapter. After my affair with the officer, I felt even more drawn there than before. It was on the Nevsky that I met him most frequently. It was there that I could admire him. He, too, went there chiefly on holidays. He, too, made way for generals and persons of high ranks, and he, too, shifted among them like an eel. But people like me, or even neater than I, he simply walked over. He made straight for them as though there were nothing but empty space before him, and never, under any circumstances, moved aside. I gloated over my resentment watching him, and resentfully made way for him every time. It tormented me that even in the street I could not be on an even footing with him. Why must you invariably be the first to move aside? I kept asking myself in hysterical rage, waking up sometimes at 3 o'clock in the morning. Why precisely you and not he? After all, there's no regulation about it. After all, there's no written law about it. Let the making way be equal, as it usually is when refined people meet. He moves halfway and you move halfway. You pass with mutual respect. But that never happened, and I always made way, while he did not even notice I moved aside for him. And lo and behold, the most astounding idea dawned upon me. What a thought! If I meet him and don't move aside? What if I don't move aside on purpose? Even if I were to bump into him, how would that be? This audacious idea, little by little, took such a hold on me that it gave me no peace. I dreamt of it continually, terribly, and I purposely went to the Nevsky more frequently in order to picture more vividly how I would do it and when I did do it. I was delighted. This plan seemed to me more and more practical and possible. Of course, I will not really bump him, I thought, already more good-natured in my joy. I will simply not turn aside. We'll bump against him, not very violently, but just shouldering each other, just as much as decency permits. I will bump him just as much as he bumps me. At last, I made up my mind completely. But my preparations took a great deal of time. To begin with, when I carried out my plan, I would have to look rather more decent, and I had to think of my clothes. In any case, if, for instance, there were a sort of public scandal, and the public there is of the most superflu, the Countess walks there, Prince D walks there, the whole literary world is there, I would have to be well dressed. That inspires respect, and of itself puts us in some way on equal footing in the eyes of high society. With that in mind, I asked for my salary in advance, and bought at Churkin's a pair of black gloves and a decent hat. Black gloves seemed to be both more dignified and bon ton than the lemon-colored ones which I had contemplated at first. The color is too gaudy. It looks as though one were trying to be conspicuous, and I did not take the lemon-colored ones. I had already gotten ready a good shirt with the bone studs long beforehand, but my overcoat very much delayed me. The coat in itself was a very good one. It kept me warm, but it was wadded, and it had a raccoon collar, which was at the height of vulgarity. I had to change the color at any sacrifice, and to have a beaver one like an officer's. For this purpose, I began visiting the 𝐔𝐧𝐝𝐻, and after several attempts, I lit on a piece of cheap German beaver. Though these German beavers very soon wear out and look shabby, at first, when new, they look exceedingly well. And after all, I only needed it for one occasion. I asked the price. Even so, it was too expensive. After thinking it over thoroughly, I decided to sell my raccoon collar. The rest of the money, a considerable sum for me, I decided to borrow from Anton Antonich 𝐍𝐶𝐞𝐫𝐠𝐫𝐶, my superior, an unassuming person, but grave and dependable. He never lent money to anyone, but I had, on entering the service, been specially recommended to him by an impertinent personage who had got me my job. I was terribly worried. To borrow from Anton Antonich seemed to be a monstrous and shameful. I did not sleep for 2 or 3 nights, and indeed I did not sleep well in general at the time. I was in a fever. I had a vague sinking in my heart, or suddenly it would start to throb. Throb! Anton Antonich was at first surprised. Then he frowned. Then he reflected. And did, after all, lend me the money, receiving from me a written authorization to take from my salary a fortnight later the sum that he had lent me. In this way, everything was at last ready. The handsome beaver was established in place of the mean-looking raccoon, and I had begun by degrees to get to work. It would never have done to act offhand, at random. The plan had to be carried out skillfully, by degrees. But I must confess that after many efforts I almost even began to despair. We could not run into each other, and that was all there was to it. I made every preparation. I was quite determined. It seemed as though we would run into another directly, and before I knew what I was doing, I had stepped aside for him again, and he had passed without noticing me. I even prayed as I approached him that God would grant me determination. One time, I had made up my mind thoroughly, but it ended in my stumbling and falling at his feet because at the very last instant, when I was only some 6 inches from him, my courage failed me. He very calmly stepped over me, while I flew to one side like a ball. That night I was ill again, feverish and delirious, and suddenly it ended most happily. The night before I had made up my mind not to carry out my fatal plan and to abandon it all, and with that goal in mind I went to the Nevsky for the last time, just to see how I would abandon it all. Suddenly, 3 places from my enemy, I unexpectedly made up my mind. I closed my eyes, and we ran full tilt, shoulder to shoulder, into each other. I did not budge an inch and passed him on a perfectly equal footing. He did not even look around and pretended not to notice it, but he was only pretending. I am convinced of that. I am convinced of that to this day. Of course, I got the worst of it. He was stronger, but that was not the point. The point was that I had attained my goal. I had kept up my dignity. I had not yielded a step, and had put myself publicly on an equal social footing with him. I returned home, feeling that I was perfectly avenged for everything. I was delighted. I was triumphant and sang Italian arias. Of course, I will not describe to you what happened to me 3 days later. If you had read my first chapter, Underground, you can guess for yourself. The officer was afterwards transferred. I have not seen him now for 14 years. What is the dear fellow doing now? Whom is he walking over? Chapter 2 of Part 2 of Dostoyevsky's Notes from Underground. But the period of my dissipation would end, and I always felt terribly sick afterwards. It was followed by remorse. I tried to drive it away. I felt too sick. By degrees, however, I grew used to that, too. I grew used to everything. That is, I did not really grow used to it, but rather I voluntarily resigned myself to enduring it. But I had a means of escape that reconciled everything, that was to find refuge in the sublime and the beautiful, in dreams. Of course, I was a terrible dreamer. I would dream for 3 months on end, tucked away in my corner. And you may believe me that at these moments I had no resemblance to the gentleman whom, in his chicken-hearted anxiety, put a German beaver collar on his greatcoat. I suddenly became a hero. I would not have received my 6-foot lieutenant even if he had called on me. I could not even picture him before me then. What were my dreams and how I could satisfy myself with them, it is hard to say now, but at the time I did satisfy myself with them, to some extent. Dreams were particularly sweet and vivid after a little vice. They came with remorse and with tears, with curses and transports. There were moments of such positive intoxication, of such happiness, that there was not the faintest trace of irony within me, on my honor. I had faith, hope, love. That is just it. I believed blindly at such times that by some miracle, through some external circumstance, all this would suddenly open out, expand, that suddenly a visa of suitable activity, beneficent, good, and above all, ready-made. What sort of activity, I had no idea, but the great thing was that it should all be ready for me, would rise up before me, and I should come out into the light of day, almost riding a white horse and crowned with a laurel. I could not conceive of a secondary role for myself, and for that reason I quite contentedly played the lowest one in reality. Either to be a hero or to grovel in the mud. There was nothing between. That was my ruin, for when I was in the mud I was comforted myself with the thought that at other times I was a hero, and I took refuge in this hero for the mud. For an ordinary man, say, it is shameful to defile himself, but a hero is too noble to be utterly defiled, and so he might defile himself. It is worth nothing that these attacks of the sublime and beautiful visited me even during the period of vice, and just at the time when I had sunk to the very bottom. They came in separate spurts, as though reminding me of themselves, but did not banish the vice by their appearance. On the contrary, they seemed to add a zest to it by contrast, and were only sufficiently present to serve as an appetizing sauce. That sauce was made up of contradictions and sufferings, of agonizing inward analysis, and all these torments and pinpricks lent my vice a certain piquancy, even a significance, in short, completely fulfilling the function of a good sauce. There was even a certain depth of meaning in it, and I could hardly have restrained myself for the simple, vulgar, direct, clerk-like vice, and have endured all the filthiness in it. What could have attracted me about it, and have driven me at night into the street? No, I had a noble loophole for everything. And what love, oh Lord, what love I felt at times in these dreams of mine, in those flights into the sublime and the beautiful. Though it was a fantastic love, though it was never applied to anything human in reality, yet there was so much of this love that afterwards one did not even feel the impulse to apply it in reality. That would have been a superfluous luxury. Everything, however, always passed satisfactorily into a lazy and fascinating transition into the sphere of art, that is, into the beautiful forms of life, ready-made, violently stolen from the poets and novelists and adepts to all sorts of needs and uses. I, for instance, was triumphant over everyone. Everyone, of course, lay in the dust and was forced to recognize my superiority spontaneously, and I forgave them all. I, a famous poet and a courtier, fell in love. I inherited countless millions and immediately devoted them to humanity, and at the same time I confessed before all the people my shameful deeds, which of course were not merely shameful, but contained an enormous amount of the sublime and the beautiful, something in the Manfred style. Everyone would weep and kiss me. What idiots they would be if they did not, while I would go barefoot and hungry, preaching new ideas and fighting a victorious Austerlitz against the reactionaries. Then a march would sound, an amnesty would be declared, the Pope would agree to retire from Rome to Brazil. Then there would be a ball for the whole of Italy at the Via Borghese on the shores of Lake Como. Lake Como being for that purpose transferred to the neighborhood of Rome. Then would come a scene in the bushes, etc., etc., as though you did not know all about it. You will say that it is vulgar and base to drag all this into public after all the tears and raptures I have myself admitted. But why is it base? Can you imagine that I am ashamed of it all, and that it was stupider than anything in your life, gentlemen? And I can assure you that some of these fancies were by no means badly composed. Not everything took place on the shores of Lake Como, and yet you are right. It really is vulgar and base. And what is most base of all is that I have now started to justify myself to you. And even more base than that is my making this remark now. But that's enough, or, after all, there will be no end of it. Each step will be more base than the last. I could never stand more than 3 months of dreaming at a time without feeling an irresistible desire to plunge into society. To plunge into society meant to visit my superior, Anton Antonich 𝐍𝐶. He was the only permanent acquaintance I have had in my life, and I even wonder at that fact myself now. But I even went to see him only when that phase came over me, and when my dreams had reached such a point of bliss that it became essential to embrace my fellows and all mankind immediately, and for that purpose I needed at least one human being on hand who actually existed. I had to call on Anton Antonich, however, on Tuesday, his at-home day. So I always had to adjust my passionate desire to embrace humanity so that it might fall on a Tuesday. This Anton Antonich lived on the 4th floor in a house in 5 corners, in 4 low-pitched rooms of a particularly frugal and sallow appearance, one smaller than the next. He had 2 daughters and their aunt, who used to pour out the tea. Of the daughters, one was 13 and another 14. They both had snub noses, and I was terribly embarrassed by them, because they were always whispering and giggling together. The master of the house usually sat in his study on a leather couch in front of the table with some gray-headed gentleman, usually a colleague from our office or even some other department. I never saw more than 2 or 3 visitors there, and those always the same. They talked about the excise duty, about business in the Senate, about salaries, about promotions, about His Excellency, and the best means of pleasing him, and so on and so on. I had the patience to sit like a fool beside these people for 4 hours at a stretch, listening to them without knowing what to say to them, or venturing to say a word. I became stupefied. Several times I felt myself perspiring. I was overflowed by a sort of paralysis, but that was pleasant and useful for me. On returning home, I deferred for a time my desire to embrace all mankind. I had, however, one other acquaintance of a sort, Simonov, who was an old schoolfellow. Indeed, I had a number of schoolfellows in Petersburg, but I did not associate with them, and had even given up nodding to them on the street. Perhaps I even transferred into the department I was in simply to avoid their company, and to cut off, at one stroke, all connection with my hateful childhood. Curses on that school and all those terrible years of penal servitude. In short, I parted from my schoolfellows as soon as I got into the world. There were 2 or 3 left to whom I nodded in the street. One of them was Simonov, who had been in no way distinguished at school, was of a quiet and even disposition, but I discovered in him a certain independence of character and even honesty. I don't even suppose that he was particularly limited. I had at one time spent some rather soulful moments with him, but these had not lasted long and had somehow been suddenly clouded over. He was evidently uncomfortable at these reminiscences, and was, it seemed, always afraid that I might take up at some tone again. I suspected that he had an aversion for me, but I still went on going to see him, not being completely certain of it. And so, on one occasion, on a Tuesday, unable to endure my solitude and knowing that it was Thursday, Anton Antonitch's door would be closed, I thought of Simonov. Climbing up 4 floors to his place, I was thinking that I made the man uncomfortable and that it was a mistake to go see him. But, as it always happens, that such reflections impelled me even more strongly, as though purposely, to put myself into a false position. I went in. It was almost a year since I had last seen Simonov. Part 3 of Dostoyevsky's Notes from Underground. Part 3 of Chapter 2, sorry. I found 2 more of my old schoolfellows with him. They seemed to be discussing an important matter. All of them scarcely took any notice of my entrance, which was strange, for I had not seen any of them for years. Evidently, they looked upon me as something on the level of a common fly. I had not been treated like that even at school, although everybody hated me there. I knew, of course, that they must despise me now for my lack of success in the service, and for having let myself sink so low, going about badly dressed, and so on, which seemed to them the sign of my ineptitude and insignificance. But nevertheless, I had not expected such contempt. Simonov even seemed surprised at my turning up. Even in the old days, he had always seemed surprised at my coming. All this disconcerted me. I sat down, feeling rather miserable, and began listening to what they were saying. They were engaged in an earnest and even heated discussion about a farewell dinner these gentlemen wanted to arrange together the very next day for their friend, Zhivkov, an officer in the army, who was going away to a distant province. Monsieur Zhivkov had been all the time at school with me, too. I had begun to hate him particularly in the upper classes. In the lower classes he had simply been a pretty, playful boy, whom everybody liked. I had hated him, however, even in the lower classes, just because he was a pretty and playful boy. He was always consistently poor in his work, and got worse and worse as he went on. Nevertheless, he was successfully graduated, as influence was exerted on his behalf. During his last year at school, he inherited an estate of 200 serfs, and as almost all of us were poor, he even started to boast before us. He was vulgar to the worst degree, but nevertheless he was a good-natured fellow, even when he boasted. In spite of superficial, fantastic, and rhetoric notions of honor and dignity, all but a very few of us positively groveled before Zhivkov, and the more so, the more he boasted. They did not grovel for any advantage, but simply because he had been favored by the gifts of nature. Moreover, we came somehow to accept the idea that Zhivkov was a specialist in regard to tact and good manners. That particularly infuriated me. I hated the sharp, self-confident tone of his voice, his admiration for his own witticisms, which were terribly stupid, though he was bold in his expressions. I hated his handsome but stupid face, for which I would, however, have gladly exchanged my intelligent one, and that free and easy military manners and fashion in the 40s. I hated the way in which he used to talk to his future conquests of women. He did not venture to begin with women until he had an officer's epaulets, and he was looking forward to them with impatience, and boasted of the duels he would constantly be fighting. I remember how I, invariably so taciturn, suddenly attacked Zverkov when one day he talked at a leisure moment with the schoolfellows of the affairs he would have in his future and growing as sportive as a puppy in the sun. He all at once declared that he would not leave a single village girl on his estate unnoticed, that was his droit de seigneur, and that if the peasants dared to protest, he would have them flogged and doubled their taxes, the bearded rascals. Our servile rabble applauded, but I attacked him, not at all out of compassion for the girls and their fathers, but simply because they were applauding such a beetle. I got the better of him on that occasion. But though Zverkov was stupid, he was lively and impudent, and so laughed it off, and even in such a way that my victory was not really complete. The laugh was on his side. He got the better of me on several occasions afterwards, but without malice, somehow just in jest, casually, in fun. I remained malicious and contemptuously silent. When we left school, he made advances to me. I did not rebuff them much, for I was flattered, but we soon parted naturally. Afterward, I heard of his barrack room success as a lieutenant, and of the fast life he was leading. Then there came other rumors of his successes in the service, but then he no longer greeted me in the street, and I suspected that he was afraid of compromising himself by greeting a person as insignificant as I. I also saw him once in the theater, in a third tier of boxes. By then he was a staff officer. He was twisting and twirling about, ingratiating himself with the daughters of an ancient general. In 3 years his look had gotten considerably worse, though he was still rather handsome and smart. He had somehow swelled, started to put on weight. One could see that by the time he was 30 he would be completely fat. So it was, finally, to this Zverkov that my schoolfellows were going to give a dinner on his departure. They had kept up with him for those 3 years, though privately they did not consider themselves on equal footing with him. I am convinced of that. Of Simonov's 2 visitors, one was Ferfitchkin, a Russianized German, a little fellow with the face of a monkey, a blockhead who was always deriding everyone, a very bitter enemy of mine from our days in the lower classes, a vulgar, impudent, boastful fellow who affected a most sensitive feeling of personal honor, though of course he was a wretched little coward at heart. He was one of those admirers of Zverkov who made up to their latter out of calculation and often borrowed money from him. Simonov's other visitor, Trudolyubov, was a person in no way remarkable, a military lad, tall, with a cold face, quite honest, but he worshipped success of every sort, and was only capable of thinking of promotion. He was some distant relation of Zverkov, and this, foolish as it seems, gave him a certain importance among us. He never thought me of any consequence whatsoever. While his behavior to me was not quite courteous, it was tolerable. Well, then, with 7 roubles each, said Trudolyubov, 21 rupees from the 3 of us, we can dine well. Zverkov, of course, won't pay. Of course not, since we are inviting him, Simonov decided. Can you imagine, Zverkov interrupted hotly and conceitedly, like some insolent flunky boasting to his master the general's decoration. Can you imagine that Zverkov would let us pay alone? He will accept from delicacy, but he will order half a case on his own. Why do we need half a case for the 4 of us? Observed Trudolyubov, taking notice only of the half case. So the 3 of us, with Zverkov for the 4th, 21 roubles at the Hotel de Paris at 5 o'clock tomorrow. Simonov, who had been asked to make the arrangements, concluded finally. How about 21 roubles? I asked in some agitation, even offended, apparently. If you count me, it will be 28, not 21 roubles. It seemed to me that to invite myself so suddenly and unexpectedly would be positively graceful, that they would all be conquered at once and would look at me with respect. Do you want to join? Simonov observed with displeasure, and seemed to avoid looking at me. He knew me inside out. It infuriated me that he knew me inside out. Why not? After all, I am an old schoolfellow of his too, I believe. And I must admit, I feel offended that you have left me out, I said, boiling over again. And where were we to find you? Ferfitchkin put in roughly. You were never on good terms with Zhivkov, 𝐔𝐴 added, frowning, but I had already clutched at the idea and would not let it go. I do not think that anyone has a right to judge that, I retorted in a shaking voice, as though God only knows what had happened. Perhaps that is just my reason for wishing it now, that I had not always been on good terms with him. Oh, there's no making you out with these refinements, 𝐔𝐴 jeered. We'll put your name down, Simonov decided, addressing me. Tomorrow at 5 o'clock at the Hôtel de Paris. What about the money? Ferfitchkin began in an undertone, indicating me to Simonov, but he broke off, for even Simonov was embarrassed. That will do, said 𝐔𝐴, getting up. If he wants to come so much, let him. But after all, it's a private thing, between us friends, Ferfitchkin said crossly, as he too picked up his hat. It's not an official meeting. Perhaps we do not want you at all. They went away. Ferfitchkin did not salute me in any way as he went out. 𝐔𝐴 barely nodded. Simonov, with whom I remained alone, was in some state of vexed perplexity. He looked at me strangely. He did not sit down, and did not ask me to go. Yes, tomorrow, then. Will you pay your share now? I just asked so as to know, he muttered in embarrassment. I blazed up in anger, but as I did so, I remembered that I had owed Simonov 15 rubles for ages, which I had not, indeed never, forgotten, though I had not paid it. You will understand, Simonov, that I could have had no idea when I came here. I am very much vexed that I had forgotten. All right, it doesn't matter. You can pay tomorrow after dinner. After all, I simply wanted to know. Please don't. He broke off and began pacing the room, still more vexed. As he began to walk, he began to thump his heels and stomped even louder. Am I keeping you? I asked after 2 minutes' silence. Oh, no, he started. That is, to be truthful, yes, I have to go and see someone, not far from here. He added in a sort of apologetic voice, somewhat ashamed. My goodness, but why didn't you say so? I cried, seizing my cap, with, incidentally, an astonishingly free and easy air, which was the last thing I would have expected of myself. After all, it's close by, not 2 paces away, Simonov repeated, accompanying me to the front door with a fussy air which did not suit him at all. So, 5 o'clock, punctually, tomorrow, he called down the stairs after me. He was very glad to get rid of me. I was in a fury. What possessed me? What possessed me to force myself upon them? I gnashed my teeth as I strode along the street. For a scoundrel, a pig like that Zhivkov, of course I had better not go. Of course I can just snap my fingers at them. I am not bound in any way. I'll send Simonov a note by tomorrow's post. But what made me furious was that I knew for certain that I would go, that I would purposely go. And the more tactless, the more ill-mannered my going would be, the more certainly I would go. And there was even a positive obstacle to my going. I had no money. All I had altogether was 9 rubles, but I had to give 7 of that to my servant, Apollon, for his monthly wages. That was all I paid him. He had to keep himself. Not to pay him was impossible, considering his character. But I will talk about that fellow, about that plague of mine, another time. However, I knew I would go after all and would not pay him his wages. That night I had the most hideous dreams. No wonder. The whole evening I had been oppressed by memories of my days of penal servitude at school, and could not shake them off. I was sent to this school by distant relations, upon whom I was dependent, and of whom I have heard nothing since. They sent me there, a lonely, silent boy, already crushed by their reproaches, already troubled by doubts, and looking savagely at everything around him. My schoolfellows met me with spiteful and merciless jibes because I was not like any of them. But I could not endure their taunts. I could not give in to them as cheaply as they gave in to one another. I hated them from the first, and shut myself away from everyone in timid, wounded, and disproportionate pride. Their coarseness revolted me. They laughed cynically at my face, at my clumsy figure, and yet what stupid faces they themselves had. In our school, the boys' faces somehow degenerated and grew stupider particularly. How many fine-looking boys came to us? In a few years they became repulsive-looking. Even at 16 I wondered at them morosely. Even then I was struck by the pettiness of their thoughts, the stupidity of their pursuits, their games, their conversations. They had no understanding of such essential things. They took no interest in such striking, impressive subjects that I could not help considering them inferior to myself. It was not wounded vanity that drove me to it. And for God's sake, do not thrust upon me your hackneyed remarks, repeating to nausea that I was only a dreamer, while they even then understood real life. They understood nothing. They had no idea of real life, and I swear that was what made it most indignant of them. On the contrary, the most obvious, striking reality they accepted with fantastic stupidity, and even then had already begun to respect only success. Everything that was just, but oppressed and looked down upon, they laughed at cruelly and shamefully. They took rank for intelligence. Even at 16, they already talked about a snug berth. Of course, a great deal of it was due to their stupidity, to be bad examples that constantly surrounded them in their childhood and boyhood. They were monstrously depraved. Of course, much of that, too, was superficial, and much was only affected cynicism. Of course, there were glimpses of youth and freshness in them, even beneath their depravity, but even that freshness was not attractive in them, and showed itself in a certain rakishness. I hated them terribly, though perhaps I was worse than any of them. They repaid me in kind, and did not conceal their aversion for me, but by then I did not want them to like me. On the contrary, I continually longed for them to humiliate me. To escape from their derision, I purposefully began to make all the progress I could with my studies, and forced my way to the very top. This impressed them. Moreover, they had all begun to grasp slowly that I was already reading books none of them could read, and understood things, not forming part of our school curriculum, on which they had not even heard. They took a savage and sarcastic view of it, but were morally impressed, especially as the teachers began to notice me on these grounds. The mockeries ceased, but the hostility remained, and cold and strained relations were formed between us. In the end, I could not stand it myself. With years of craving for society, for friends developed in me, I attempted to get on friendly terms with some of my schoolfellows, but somehow or other, my intimacy with them was always strained, and soon ended of itself. Once, indeed, I did have a friend, but I was already a tyrant at heart. I wanted to exercise unlimited power over him. I tried to instill in him a contempt for his surroundings. I required of him a disdainful and complete break with these surroundings. I frightened him with my passionate affection. I reduced him to tears, to convulsions. He was a simple and devoted soul. But when he submitted to me completely, I began to hate him immediately and rejected him, as though all I needed him for was to win a victory over him, to subjugate him and nothing else. But I could not subjugate all of them. My friend was not like all of them either. He was in fact a rare exception. The first thing I did on leaving school was to give up the special job for which I had been destined, so as to break all ties, to curse my past and scatter it to the winds. And goodness knows why, after all that, I should drag myself to that Simonov. Early next morning I roused myself and jumped out of bed with excitement, as though it were all about to happen at once. But I believed that some radical change in my life was coming. and would inevitably come that day, owing to its rarity. Perhaps any external event, however trivial, always made me feel as though some radical change in my life would occur immediately. I always went to the office as usual, however, but slipped away home 2 hours early to get ready. The important thing, I thought, is not to be the first to arrive, or they will think I was overjoyed at coming. But there were thousands of such important points to consider, and they all agitated me to the point of impotence. I polished my boots a second time with my own hands. Nothing in the world could have induced Apollon to clean them twice a day, and he considered that it was more than his duties required of him. I stole the brushes to clean from them the passage, so that he would not detect it and then start to despise me. Then I minutely examined my clothes and found that everything looked old, worn, and threadbare. I had let myself get too slovenly. My uniform perhaps was in good shape, but I could hardly go to dinner in my uniform. And the worst thing was that the knee on my trousers had a big yellow stain. I had a foreboding that that stain would in itself deprive me of 9/10 of my personal dignity. I knew, too, that it was stooping very low to think this. But this is no time for thinking. Now the real thing is beginning, I thought, and my heart sank. I knew, too, perfectly well, even then, that I was monstrously exaggerating the facts. But how could I help it? I could not control myself, and I was already shaking with fever. With despair, I pictured to myself how coldly and disdainfully that scoundrel Zhivkov would greet me, and what dull-witted, absolutely profound contempt the blockhead true boldly above would look at me. With what nasty insolence that beetle Ferfitchkin would snigger at me in order to curry favor with Zhivkov, and how completely Simonov would take it all in, and how he would despise me for the abjectness of my vanity and faint-heartedness, and worst of all, how paltry, unliterary, commonplace it would all be. Of course, the best thing would be not to go at all. But that was the most impossible thing of all. Once I feel impelled to do something, I am completely drawn into it, head first. I would have jeered at myself ever afterward. So you funked it. You funked the real thing. You funked it. On the contrary, I passionately longed to show all that rabble that I was not at all such a coward as I pictured myself. What is more, even in the acutest paroxysm of this cowardly fever, I dreamt of getting the upper hand, of overcoming them, carrying them away, making them like me, if only for my elevation of thought and unmistakable wit. They would abandon Zhivkov. He would sit on one side, silent and ashamed, while I would crush Zhivkov. Then perhaps I would be reconciled to him and toast our camaraderie. But that was the most spiteful and insulting thing for me, was that I knew even then, knew completely and for certain, that I needed nothing of all this reality, that I did not really want to crush, to subdue, to abstract them, and that I would be the first one not to care a straw, really, for the result, even if I did achieve it. Ah, how I prayed to God for the day to pass quickly. In inexpressible anguish I went to the window, opened a pane, and looked out into the turbid darkness of the thickly falling wet snow. At last my wretched little wall clock hissed out 5. I seized my hat, trying not to look at Apollon, who had been all day expecting his month's wages, but in his pride was unwilling to be the first to speak about it. I slipped past him, and out the door, and jumped into a high-class sledge, on which I spent my last half a rouble. I drove up in grand style to the Hotel de Paris. Cool. A moment, let's take a little respite. Hey. So, that was chapters 1 and 2 of part 2 of Dostoyevsky's Notes for Underground. Yeah. Hey. Earl Grey. Cheers. Cheers if anybody else is enjoying anything. It would do to have a conversation if we could discuss any points that we've come to yet far. Yet so far, everything, from what I can tell, seems to flush out in fine strokes the personality of the underground man. And to be perfectly frank, I'm beyond relieved. I'm very relieved to read instances in this character's life that don't completely match my idiosyncrasies, my temperaments of character. Thank God there's some degree of separation between us, was all I was thinking while reading so far. That is a relief. Now, let us continue. Chapter 4. I had already known the day before that I would be the first to arrive, but it was no longer a question of precedence. Not only were they not there, but I even had difficulty finding our room. The table had still not been completely set. What did it mean? After a good many questions, I finally ascertained from the waiters that the dinner had been ordered not for 5, but for 6 o'clock. This was confirmed at the buffet, too. I even felt ashamed to go on questioning them. It was still only 25 minutes past 5. If they changed their dinner hour, they ought to, in any case, have let me know. That is what the post is for, and not to have subjected me to shame, both in my own eyes. Well, before the waiters, I sat down. The servants began to set the table. I felt even more insulted when he was present. Towards 6 o'clock, they brought in candles, though there were lamps burning in the room. It had not occurred to the waiters, however, to bring them in at once when I arrived. In the next room, 2 gloomy, angry-looking persons were eating their dinners in silence at 2 different tables. There were a great deal of noise, even shouting, in a room further away. One could hear the laughter of a crowd of people, the nasty little shrieks in French. There were ladies at the dinner. In short, it was sickening. I rarely passed a more unpleasant time. So much so that when they did arrive altogether punctually at 6, I was for the first moment overjoyed to see them, as though they were my deliverers, and almost forgot it was incumbent upon me to look insulted. 𝐍𝐸𝐿 walked in at the head of them. Evidently, he was the leading spirit. He and all of them were laughing, but seeing me, 𝐍𝐸𝐿 drew himself up, walked up to me unhurriedly, with a slight, rather jaunty bend from the waist, and shook hands with me in a friendly, but not overly friendly fashion, with a sort of circumspect courtesy almost like a general's, as though in giving me his hand he were warding off something. I had imagined, on the contrary, that as soon as he came in, he would immediately break into his former thin, shrieking laugh and fall to making his insipid jokes and witticisms. I had been prepared for them ever since the previous day, but I had never expected such condescension, such high official courtesy. So, then, he felt himself immeasurably superior to me in every respect. If he had only meant to insult me by that high official tone, it would still have not mattered, I thought. I could pay him back for it one way or another. But what if in reality, without the least desire to be offensive, that sheep's head had seriously acquired the notion that he was immeasurably superior to me and could only look at me in a patronizing way? The very supposition made me gasp. "I was surprised to hear of your desire to join us," he began, lisping and drawling, which was something new. "You and I seem to have seen nothing of one another. You fight shy of us. You shouldn't. We are not such terrible people as you think. Well, anyway, I am glad to renew our acquaintance." Then he turned carelessly to put down his hat on the windowsill. "Have you been waiting long?" Čibolia above inquired. I arrived punctually at 6 o'clock as I was informed yesterday, I answered aloud, with an irritability that promised an immediate explosion. Didn't you let him know that we had changed the hour? Said Trudolyubov to Simonov. Nah, I didn't. I forgot, the latter replied, with no sign of regret, and without even apologizing to me, he went off to order the hors d'oeuvres. Hors d'oeuvres. He went off to order the hors d'oeuvres. So, you've been here a whole hour, you poor fellow, Zverkov cried ironically, for according to his notions, this was bound to be extremely funny. That scoundrel Ferfitchkin followed him with his nasty little snigger like a puppy yapping. My position struck him too as extremely ludicrous and embarrassing. It isn't funny at all, I cried to Ferfitchkin, more and more irritated. It wasn't my fault, but other people's. They neglected to let me know. It was simply absurd. It's not only absurd, but something else as well, muttered Trudolyubov, naively taking my part. You are too complacent about it. It was simply rudeness. Unintentional, of course, but how could Simonov... If a trick like that had been played on me, observed Ferfitchkin, I would. But you should have ordered yourself something, Zverkov interrupted, or simply asked for dinner without waiting for us. You will allow that I might have done that without your permission, I rapped out. If I waited, it was, let us sit down, gentlemen, cried Simonov, coming in. Everything is ready. I can answer for the champagne. It is capitally chilled. After all, I did not know your address. Where was I to look for you? He suddenly turned to me, but again he seemed to avoid looking at me. Evidently he had something against me. He must have made up his mind after what happened yesterday. Everybody sat down. I did the same. It was a round table. Trudolyubov was on my left, Simonov on my right. Zverkin was sitting opposite, Ferfitchkin next to him, between him and Trudolyubov. Tell me, are you in a government agency? Zverkov went on, attending to me. Seeing that I was embarrassed, he seriously thought that he ought to be friendly to me, and, so to speak, cheer me up. Does he want me to throw a bottle at his head or something? I thought in a fury. In my unaccustomed surroundings, I was unnaturally quick to be irritated. In the office, I answered jerkily, with my eyes on the plate. And have you a good berth? Tell me, what made you leave your former job? What made me was I wanted to leave my original job. I drawled twice as much as he, hardly able to control myself. Ferfitchkin snorted. Simonov looked at me ironically. Trudolyubov stopped eating and began looking at me with a curiosity. Zverkov was jarred, but he pretended not to notice it. And the remuneration? What remuneration? I mean, your salary. Why are you cross-examining me? However, I told him at once what my salary was. I blushed terribly. It's not very handsome, Zverkov observed majestically. Yes, you can't afford to dine in restaurants on that, Ferfitchkin added insolently. I think it's very low, Trudolyubov observed gravely. And how thin you have grown. How you have changed, added Zverkov with a shade of venom in his voice, scanning me and my attire with a sort of insolent compassion. Oh, spare your blushes, cried Ferfitchkin, sniggering. My dear sir, permit me to tell you I am not blushing, I broke out at last. Do you hear me? I dine here, at this restaurant, at my own expense, at mine, not other people's. Note that, Monsieur Ferfitchkin. What do you mean? Isn't everyone here dining at his own expense? You seem to be. Ferfitchkin let fly at me, turning red as a lobster. He looked at me in a face of fury. That's what I mean, I answered, feeling I had gone too far. and I imagine it would have been better to talk of something more intelligent. You intend to show off your intelligence, I suppose. Don't disturb yourself. That would be quite out of place here. What are you clacking away like that for, my good sir? Have you gone out of your wits in your dumpartment? Enough, gentlemen, enough, Zverkov cried authoritatively. How stupid it is, muttered Simonov. It really is stupid. We met here, a company of friends, for a farewell dinner to a good comrade, and you are settling old scores, said Trudolyubov, rudely addressing himself to me alone. Yesterday you invited yourself to join us, so don't disturb the general harmony. Enough, enough, cried Zverkov. Stop it, gentlemen, it's out of place. Better let me tell you how I nearly got married the day before yesterday. And then followed a burlesque narrative of how this gentleman had almost been married 2 days before. There was not a word about marriage, however, but the story was adorned with generals, colonels, and high courtiers, while Zverkov practically took the lead among them. It was greeted with approving laughter. Ferfitchkin even squealed. No one paid any attention to me. I sat crushed and humiliated. Good heavens, these are not the people for me, I thought, and what a fool I have made of myself before them. I let that Ferfitchkin go too far, though. The brutes imagine that it is an honor for me to sit down with them. They don't understand that I do them an honor. I to them, and not they to me. I've grown thinner. My clothes, oh, damn my trousers. Zverkov long ago noticed the yellow stain on the knee, but what's the use? I must get up at once, this very minute, take my hat, and simply go without a word, out of contempt, and tomorrow I can send a challenge. That scoundrel, after all, I don't think about the 7 rubles. They may think, damn it, I don't care about the 7 rubles. I'll go this minute. Of course I remained. I drank sherry and Lafitte by the glassful in my distress. Being unaccustomed to it, I quickly became intoxicated, and my annoyance increased with the intoxication. I longed all at once to insult them all in a most flagrant manner, and then go away, to seize the moment and show what I could do, so that they would say, though he is absurd, he's clever, and, in short, damn them all. I scanned them all insolently with my dulled eyes, but they seemed to have forgotten me altogether. They were noisy, vociferous, cheerful. Zverkov kept talking. I began to listen. Zverkov was talking about the sumptuous lady whom he at last had led on to declaring her love. Of course he was lying like a horse. And how he had been helped in this affair by an intimate friend of his, a Prince Kolya, an officer in the hussars, who had 3,000 serfs. And yet this Kolya, who had 3,000 serfs, has not put in appearance here tonight at all to see you off. I cut in suddenly. For a moment, everyone was silent. Are you drunk already? Trudolyubov designed to notice me at last, glancing contemptuously in my direction, Zverkov without a word, examining me as though I were a little beetle. I dropped my eyes. Simonov made haste to fill up the glasses with champagne. Trudolyubov raised his glass, as did everybody else but me. Your health and good luck on your journey, he cried to Zverkov. To old times, gentlemen, to our future, hurrah! They all tossed off their glasses and crowded around Zverkov to kiss him. I did not move. My full glass stood untouched before me. Why, aren't you going to drink it? Roared Trudolyubov, losing impatience and turning maliciously toward me. I want to make a toast separately, on my own account, and then I'll drink it, Mr. Trudolyubov. Disgusting crank, muttered Simonov. I drew myself up in my chair and feverishly seized my glass, preparing for something extraordinary, though I did not know myself what precisely I was going to say. Silence, cried Ferfitchkin in French. Now for a display of wit. Zverkov waited very gravely, knowing what was coming. Lieutenant Zverkov, I began, let me tell you that I hate phrases, phrasemongers and corseted waists. That's the first point. And there is a second one to follow it. There was a general stir. The second point is, I hate dirty stories and people who tell dirty stories, especially people who tell dirty stories. The third point, I love truth, sincerity, and honesty. I went on almost mechanically, for I was beginning to shiver with horror, and I had no idea how I had come to talking like this. I love thought, Monsieur Sverkov. I love true comradeship, on an equal footing and not... I love... But however, why not? I will drink to your health too, Monsieur Sverkov. Seduce the Circassian girls, shoot the enemies of the fatherland, and to your health, Monsieur Sverkov. Sverkov got out of his seat, bowed to me, and said, I am very much obliged to you. He was frightfully offended and even turned pale. Damn the fellow, roared Trudolyubov, bringing his fist down on the table. Well, he ought to be punched in the nose for that, squealed Ferfitchkin. We ought to turn him out, muttered Semenov. Not a word, gentlemen, not a movement, Sverkov solemnly checking his general indignation. I thank you all, but I can show him for myself how much value I attach to his words. Mr. Ferfitchkin, will you give me satisfaction tomorrow at the latest hour for your words just now? I said aloud, turning with dignity to Ferfitchkin. A duel, you mean? Certainly, he answered. But probably I was so ridiculous as I challenged him, and it was so out of keeping with my appearance that everyone, including Ferfitchkin, roared with laughter. Yes, let him alone, of course. After all, he is completely drunk, Trudolyubov said with disgust. I will never forgive myself for letting him join us, Semenov muttered again. Now was the time to throw a bottle at their heads, I thought to myself. I picked up the bottle and poured myself a full glass. No, I had better sit on to the end, I went on thinking. You would be pleased, my friends, if I left. Nothing would induce me to go. I'll go on sitting here and drinking to the end on purpose, as a sign that I don't attach the slightest importance to you. I will go on sitting and drinking because this is a public house and I paid my entrance money. I will sit here and drink, for I look upon you as so many pawns, as inanimate pawns. I'll sit here and drink and sing if I want to. Yes, sing, for I have the right to sing. But I did not sing. I simply tried not to look at any of them. I assumed most unconcerned attitudes and waited with impatience for them to speak, first, of their own accord. But alas, they did not speak. And oh, how I wished at that moment to be reconciled to them. It struck 8, at last 9. They moved from the table to the sofa. Sverkov stretched himself on the couch and put one foot on the round table. The wine was brought there. He did, as a matter of fact, order 3 bottles on his own account. He did, of course, invite me to join them. He didn't, of course, invite me to join them. They all sat around him on the sofa. They listened to him, also with reverence. It was evidence that they were fond of him. For what? For what? I wondered. From time to time, they were moved to drunken enthusiasms and kissed each other. They talked of the Caucasus, of the nature of true passion, of adventurous jobs in the service, of the income of the hussar called Podkersetsky, whom none of them knew personally, and rejoiced that he had a large income, of the extraordinary grace and beauty of the Princess D, whom none of them had ever seen. Then it came to Shakespeare's being immortal. I smiled contemptuously and walked up and down the other side of the room, opposite the sofa, along the wall, from the table to the stove and back again. I tried my very utmost to show them that I could do without them, and yet I purposefully stomped my boots, thumping with my heels, and it was all in vain. They paid no attention to it. I had the patience to walk up and down in front of them that way from 8 o'clock until 11, in one and the same place, from the table to the stove, and from the stove back to the table. I walked up and down to please myself, and no one can prevent me. The waiter, who came into the room several times, stopped to look at me. I was somewhat giddy in turning around so often. At moments it seemed to me that I was in delirium. During those 3 hours, I was 3 times soaked with sweat and then dry again. At times it was an intense, acute pang. I was stabbed to the heart by the thought of that 10 years, 20 years, 40 years would pass. Then even in 40 years I would remember with loathing and humiliation those filthiest, most ludicrous, and most terrible moments of my life. No one could have gone out of his way to degrade himself more shamelessly and voluntarily, and I finally realized it, fully. And yet I went on pacing up and down from the table to the stove. Oh, if you only knew what thoughts and feelings I am capable of, how cultured I am, I thought at moments, mentally addressing the sofa on which my enemies were sitting. But my enemies behaved as though I did not exist in the room. Once, only once, they turned towards me, just when 𝐍𝐸𝐿 was talking about Shakespeare, and I suddenly gave a contemptuous laugh. I snorted in such an affected and nasty way that they all at once broke off their conversation, and silently and gravely for 2 minutes watching me walking up and down from the table to the stove, paying no attention whatsoever to them. But nothing came of it. They said nothing, and 2 minutes later they ceased to notice me again. It struck 11. "Gentlemen," cried 𝐍𝐸𝐿, getting up from the table, "let us go there now." Of course, the others said. I turned sharply to 𝐍𝐸𝐿. I was so exhausted, so broken, that I would have cut my throat to put an end to it. I was in a fever. My hair, soaked with perspiration, stuck to my forehead and temples. 𝐍𝐸𝐿, I beg your pardon, I said abruptly and resolutely. 𝐸𝐸𝐿, yours too, and everyone's. I have insulted you all. Aha! A duel is not in your line, old man, 𝐸𝐸𝐿 hissed venomously. It sent a deep pang to my heart. No, it's not the duel I'm afraid of, 𝐸𝐸𝐿. I am ready to fight you tomorrow, after we are reconciled. I insist upon it, in fact, and you cannot refuse. I want to show you that I am not afraid of a duel. You will fire first, and I will fire into the air. He is comforting himself, remarked 𝐍𝐸𝐿. He is simply raving, declared 𝐷𝐸𝐿. But let us pass. Why are you barring our way? Well, what do you want? 𝐍𝐸𝐿 answered disdainfully. They were all flushed. Their eyes were bright. They had been drinking heavily. I asked for your friendship, 𝐍𝐸𝐿. I insulted you, but... Insulted? You insulted me? Permit me to tell you, sir, that you never, under any circumstances, could possibly insult me. And that's enough of you. Out of the way, concluded 𝐷𝐸𝐿. Let's go. Olympia is mine, gentlemen. That's agreed, cried 𝐍𝐸𝐿. We won't dispute your right, the others answered, laughing. I stood as though spat upon. The party went noisily out of the room. 𝐷𝐸𝐿 stuck up some stupid song. 𝐍𝐸𝐿 remained behind for a moment to tip the waiter. I suddenly went up to him. 𝐍𝐸𝐿, give me 6 rubles, I said decisively and desperately. He looked at me in extreme amazement, with dulled eyes. He, too, was drunk. You don't mean you are even coming with us there? Yes. I have no money, he snapped out, but with a scornful laugh he went out of the room. I clutched at his overcoat. It was a nightmare. 𝐍𝐸𝐿, I saw you had money. Why do you refuse me? Am I a scoundrel? Beware of refusing me. If you knew it, if you knew why I am asking. Everything depends on it. My whole future, my whole plans. 𝐍𝐸𝐿 pulled out of the way and almost flung it at me. Take it, if you have no sense of shame, he pronounced pitilessly, and ran to overtake them. I was left alone for a moment. Disorder. The remains of dinner. A broken wine glass on the floor. Spilt wine, cigarette butts, intoxication and delirium in my brain, and agonizing misery in my heart. And finally, the waiter, who had seen and heard all and was looking inquisitively into my face. "I am going there," I shouted. "Either they will all fall down on their knees and beg my friendship, or I will give 𝐍𝐵𝐺𝐽𝐸 a slap in the face." Now, chapter 5 of part 2. So this is it at last. A clash with reality, I muttered as I ran headlong downstairs. This, it seems, is very different from the Pope's leaving Rome and going to Brazil. This, it seems, is very different from the ball on the shores of Lake Como. "You are a scoundrel," flashed through my mind. "If you laugh at this now—" "No matter," I cried, answering myself. "Now everything is lost." There was no trace of them left. But that made no difference. I knew where they had gone. At the steps was standing a solitary night sledge driver in a rough peasant coat, powdered over with the wet and, as it were, warm snow that was still falling thickly. It was sultry and warm. The little shaggy piebald horse that was also powdered with snow and was coughing, I remember that very well. I made a rush for the roughly made sledge, but as soon as I raised my foot to get in it, the recollection of how Simonov had just given me 6 rubles seemed to double me up, and I tumbled into the sledge like a sack. "No, I must do a great deal to make up for all of that," I cried, "but I will make up for it or perish on the spot this very night. Start!" We went off. There was an absolute whirl in my head. They won't go down on their knees and beg for my friendship. That's a mirage, a cheap mirage, revolting, romantic, and fantastical. That is another ball at Lake Como. And so I have to slap 𝐍𝐵𝐺𝐸's face. It is my duty to. And so it is settled. I am flying to give him a slap in the face. Hurry up! The cabbie tugged at the reins. As soon as I go in, I'll give it to him. Ought I to say a few words by way of preface before giving him the slap? No, I'll simply go in and give it to him. They will all be sitting in the drawing room. He, with Olympia on the sofa. That damned Olympia. She laughed at my looks on one occasion and refused me. I'll pull Olympia's hair, pull 𝐍𝐵𝐺𝐸's ears, no, better one ear, and pull him by it around the room. Maybe they will all begin beating me and kick me out. That is even very likely. No matter. Anyway, I will slap him first. The initiative will be mine, and according to the code of honor, that is everything. He will be branded and no blows can wipe off the slap. Nothing but a duel can. He will be forced to fight, and let them beat me then. Let them, the ungrateful wretches. Trudolyubov will beat me hardest. He is so strong. Ferfitchkin is sure to catch hold of me from the side and tug at my hair. But no matter. That's what I am going for. The blockheads will be forced at last to see the tragedy of it all. When they drag me to the door, I shall call out to them that in reality they are not worth my little finger. Go on, driver, get on! I cried to the driver. He started and flicked his whip. I shouted so savagely. We shall fight at daybreak. That's the settled thing. I am through with the department. Ferfitchkin called the department Dumpartment before. But where can I get pistols? Nonsense, I'll call my salary in advance and buy them. The powder and bullets. That's the second business. How can it all be done by daybreak? And where am I to get a second? I have no friends. Nonsense, I cried, lashing myself more and more into a fury. Nonsense. The first person I meet in the street is bound to be my second, just as he would be bound to pull a drowning man out of the water. The strangest thing may happen. Even if I were to ask the director himself to be my second tomorrow, even he would be bound to consent, if only for a feeling of chivalry. and to keep the secret. Anton Antonich? The fact is that at the very minute the disgusting absurdity of my plans and the other side of the question were clearer and more vivid to my imagination than they could be to anyone on earth. But... "Get on, driver! Get on, you rascal! Get on!" Sir," said the son of toil. Cold shivers suddenly ran down my back. Wouldn't it be better to go straight home now? Oh my God. Why did I invite myself to this dinner yesterday? But no, it's impossible. And my 3 hours walk from the table to the stove. No, they and no one else must pay for my walking up and down. They must wipe out this dishonor. Drive on! And what if they hand me over to the police? They won't dare. They'll be afraid of the scandal. And what if Sverkov is too contemptuous that he refuses to fight a duel? That is even sure to happen. But on that case I'll show up. I will turn up at the posting station. When he is setting off tomorrow, I'll catch him by the leg. I'll pull off his coat when he gets into the carriage. I'll get my teeth into his hand. I'll bite him. See to what lengths you can drive a desperate man. He may hit me on the head, and he may pummel me from behind. He may shout to a whole crowd of spectators, "Look at this young puppy who is driving off to captivate the Circassian girls after letting me spit in his face." Of course, after that everything will be over. The department will have vanished off the face of the earth. I will be arrested. I will be tried. I will be dismissed from the service, thrown in prison, sent to Siberia, deported. Never mind. In 15 years, when they let me out of prison, I will trudge off to him, a beggar in rags. I shall find him in some provincial city. He will be married and happy. He will have a grown-up daughter. I will say to him, "Look, monster, at my hollow cheeks and my rags. I've lost everything. My career, my happiness, art, science, the woman I loved, and all through you. Here are pistols. I have come to discharge my pistol, and I forgive you." Then I will fire into the air, and he will hear nothing more of me. I was actually on the point of tears, though I know perfectly well at that very moment that all this was out of Pushkin's, Silvio, and Lemontov's masquerade, and all at once I felt terribly ashamed. So ashamed that I stopped the sledge, stepped out of it, and stood in the snow in the middle of the street. The driver sighed and gazed at me in astonishment. What was I to do? I could not go on there. It was clearly absurd, and I could not leave things as they were now, because they would seem as though... Heavens! How could I leave things after such insults? "No!" I cried, throwing myself into the sledge again. "It is ordained. It is fate. Drive on. Drive to that place." And in my impatience, I punched the sledge driver on the back of the neck. "What are you up to? What are you hitting me for?" the poor man shouted back, but he whipped up his nag so that it began to kick out. The wet snow was falling in big flakes. I unbuttoned myself. I did not care about it. I forgot everything else, for I had finally decided on the slap, and felt with horror that after all that was going to happen, now, at once, that it would happen immediately, and that no force could stop it. The deserted street lamps gleamed sullenly in the snowy darkness like torches at a funeral. The snow drifted under my greatcoat, under my coat, under my necktie, and melted there. I did not cover myself up. After all was already lost anyway. At last we arrived. I jumped out, almost fainting, ran up the steps, and began knocking and kicking at the door. My legs, particularly at the knee, felt terribly weak. The door was opening quickly as though they knew I was coming. As a matter of fact, Simonov had warned them that perhaps another would arrive, and this was a place in which one had to give notice and to observe certain precautions. It was one of the military establishments, which were abolished by the police a long time ago. By day it really was a shop, but at night, if one had an introduction, one might visit it for other purposes. I walked rapidly through the dark shop into the familiar drawing room, where there was only one candle burning, and stopped in amazement. There was no one there. "Where are they?" I asked somebody, but by now, of course, they had separated. Before me stood a person with a stupid smile. The Madame herself, who had seen me before. A minute later, a door opened and another person came in. Paying no attention to anything, I strode about the room, and I believe I talked to myself. I felt as though I had been saved from death and was conscious of it. Joyfully, all over. After all, I would have given that slap. I would have certainly have given it. But now they were not here, and everything had vanished and changed. I looked around. I could not believe my condition yet. I looked mechanically at the girl who had come in and had glimpsed of a fresh, rather young, pale face, with straight, dark eyebrows and with a grave, as it were, amazed glance. Eyes that attracted me at once. I would have hated her if she had been smiling. I began looking at her more intently, and, as it were, with effort. I had not fully collected my thoughts. There was something simple and good-natured in her face, but something strangely serious. I am sure that this stood in her way here, and that not one of those fools had noticed her. She could not, however, have been called a beauty, though she was tall, strong-looking, and well-built. She was simply dressed. Something loathsome stirred within me. I went straight up to her. I happened to look at myself in a mirror. The harassed face struck me as extremely revolting, pale, spiteful, nasty, with disheveled hair. No matter, I am glad of it, I thought. I am glad that I even seem revolting to her. I like that. Chapter 6. Pardon me. That was awkward. Sorry. I guess I kicked at the cables underneath the table. Okay. We are chapter 6. Somewhere behind a screen, a clock began wheezing, as though under some great pressure, as though someone were strangling it. After an unnaturally prolonged wheezing, there followed a shrill, nasty, and as it were, unexpected rigid chime, as though someone were suddenly jumping forward. It struck 2. I woke up, though I had not really been asleep, but lay semi-conscious. It was almost completely dark in the narrow, cramped, low-pitched room, cluttered up with an enormous wardrobe and a pile of cardboard boxes and all sorts of frippery and litter. The candle stump had been burning on the table. The candle stump that had been burning on the table was going out, and it gave a faint flicker from time to time. In a few minutes, it would be completely dark. I was not long in coming to myself. Everything came back to my mind at once, without an effort, as though it had been an ambush to pounce upon me again. And indeed, even while I was unconscious, a point continually seemed to remain in my memory that could not ever be forgotten, and around it my dreams moved drearily, but strange, so to say. Everything that had happened to me during that day seemed to me now, on waking, to be in the far, far away distance, as though I had long, long ago lived all that down. My head was heavy. Something seemed to be hovering over me, provoking me, rousing me, and making me restless. Misery and gall seemed to surge up in me again and to seek an outlet. Suddenly I saw beside me 2 wide-open eyes scrutinizing me curiously and persistently. The look in those eyes was coldly detached, sullen, utterly detached, as it were. It weighed heavily on me. A grim idea came into my brain and passed all over my body like some nasty sensation, such as one feels when one goes into a damp and moldy cellar. It was somehow unnatural that those 2 eyes only now thought of beginning to examine me. I recalled, too, that during those 2 hours I had not said a single word to the creature, and had, in fact, considered it entirely unnecessary. It had, even for some reason, gratified me before. Now I suddenly realized vividly how absurd, revolting as a spider was the idea of vice which, without love, grossly and shamelessly began directing with that in which true love finds its consummation. For a long time we gazed at each other like that, but she did not drop her eyes before mine, and did not change her expression, so that at last, somehow, I felt uncomfortable. "What is your name?" I asked abruptly, and put an end to it quickly. "Lisa," she answered almost in a whisper, but somehow without any friendliness. She turned her eyes away. I was silent. "What weather today? The snow? It's abominable," I said, almost to myself, putting my arm under my head despondently and gazing at the ceiling. She made no answer. This was all outrageous. "Are you a local girl?" I asked a minute later, almost angrily, turning my head slightly toward her. "No." "Where do you come from?" "From Riga," she answered reluctantly. "Are you German?" "No, Russian." "Have you been here long?" "Where?" "In this house?" "A fortnight." She spoke more and more jerkily. The candles went out. I could no longer distinguish her face. "Have you a father and mother?" "Yes." "No." "I have." "Where are they?" "There." "In Riga." "What are they?" "Oh, nothing." "Nothing? Why, what do they do?" "Tradespeople." "Have you always lived with them?" "Yes." "How old are you?" 20. "Why did you leave them?" "Oh, for no reason." That answer meant, "Leave me alone. I feel wretched." We were silent. God knows why I did not go away. I felt myself more and more wretched and dreary. The images of the previous day started to flit through my mind in confusion, independently of my will. I suddenly recalled something I had seen that morning when, full of anxious thoughts, I was hurrying to the office. I saw them carrying a coffin out yesterday, and they nearly dropped it. I suddenly said aloud, with no desire at all to start a conversation, but just so, almost by accident. A coffin? Yes, in the Haymarket. They were bringing it up out of a cellar. From a cellar? Not a cellar, but from a basement. Oh, you know, down below. From a house of ill fame. It was filthy all around, eggshells, litter, a stench. It was loathsome. Silence. A nasty day to be buried. I began simply to avoid being silent. Nasty? In what way? The snow, the wet. I yawned. It doesn't matter, she said suddenly after a brief silence. No, it's abominable. I yawned again. The grave diggers must have sworn at getting drenched by the snow. And there must have been water in the grave. Why would there be water in the grave? She asked with a sort of curiosity, but speaking even more harshly and abruptly than before. I suddenly began to feel provoked. Why, there must have been water at the bottom, a foot deep. You can't dig a dry grave in Volkovo Cemetery. Why? Why, the place is waterlogged. It's a regular marsh, so they bury them in water. I've seen it myself, many times. I had never seen it at all. And I had never even been to Volkovo, but had only heard stories of it. Do you mean to say it doesn't matter to you whether you die? But why should I die? She answered, as though defending herself. Why, someday you will die, and you will die just the same way as that dead woman. She was a girl like you. She died of consumption. That wench would have died in a hospital, too. She knows all about it already. She said wench, not girl. She was in debt to her madame, I retorted, more and more provoked by the discussion, and went on earning money for her almost up to the very end, though she was in consumption. Some coachmen standing by were talking about her to some soldiers and telling them so, no doubt her former acquaintances. They were laughing. They were going to meet in a pothouse to drink to her memory. I lied a great deal here. Silence followed, profound silence. She did not even stir. And is it better to die in a hospital? Isn't it just the same? Besides, why should I die? She added irritably. If not now, a little later. Why a little later? Why indeed? Now you are young, pretty, fresh. You fetch a high price. But after another year of this life, you will be very different. You will fade. In a year? Anyway, in a year, you will be worthless. Worthless, I continued malignantly. You will go from here to something lower, another house, a year later to a third, lower and lower, and in 7 years you will come to a basement in the Haymarket. And that's if you are lucky. But it would be much worse if you get some disease, consumption, say, and caught a chill or something or other. It's not easy to get over an illness in your way of life. If you catch anything, you may not get rid of it. And so you will die. Oh, well, then I die, she answered, quite vindictively. And she made a quick movement. But after all, it's a pity. For whom? Pity for life. Silence. Were you engaged? Eh? What's that to you? Oh, I am not cross-examining you. It's nothing to me. Why are you so cross? Of course you may have had your own troubles. What is it to me? I simply felt sorry. For whom? Sorry for you. No need. She whispered, hardly audibly, and again made a faint movement. That incensed me at once. What? I was so gentle with her, and she... Why, what do you think? Are you on the right path? Huh? I don't think anything. That's what's wrong. That you don't think. Wake up while there is still time. And there is still time. You are still young, good-looking. You might love, be married, be happy. Not all married women are happy, she snapped out in a rude, fast way she had spoken before. Not all, of course, but anything is much better than the life here, infinitely better. Besides, with love one can live even without happiness. Even in sorrow, life is sweet. Life is sweet, however one lives it, but here you have nothing except foulness. Phew! I turned away with disgust. I was no longer reasoning coldly. I began to feel myself what I was saying, and warmed to the subject. I was already longing to expound the cherished little ideas I had been brooding over in my corner. Something suddenly flared up in me. An object had appeared before me. Never mind my being here. I'm not an example for you. I am, perhaps, even worse than you are. I was drunk when I came here, though. I hastened, however, to say in self-idleness. Besides, a man is no example for a woman. It's a different thing. It may degrade and defile myself, but I am not anyone's slave. I come and go, and there's an end to it. I shake it off, and I am a different man. But you are a slave from the start. Yes, a slave. You give up everything, your whole freedom. If you want to break your chains afterwards, you won't be able to. You will be caught more and more in the snares. It is an accursed bondage. I know it. I won't mention anything else. Maybe you won't understand it, but tell me. After all, surely you are in debt to your madam already. There, you see, I added, though she made no answer, but only listened in silence, entirely absorbed. That's bondage for you. You will never buy your freedom. They will see to that. It's like selling your soul to the devil. And besides, perhaps I, too, am just as unfortunate. How do you know? And wallow in the mud on purpose, also out of misery. After all, men take to drink out of grief. Well, maybe I am here out of grief. Come, tell me, what good is there here? Here you and I were intimate just now and did not say one word to another all this time, and it was only afterward you began staring at me like a wild creature, and I at you. Is that loving? Is that how human beings are intimate? It's hideous, that's what it is. Yes, she assented sharply and hurriedly. I was even amazed by the eagerness of this yes, so the same thought may have been straying through her mind when she was staring at me just before. So she, too, was capable of certain thoughts. Damn all this. This was curious. This was kinship, I thought, almost rubbing my hands. And indeed, how can one fail to manage a young soul like that? The sport in it attracted me most. She turned her head nearer to me, and it seemed to me in her darkness that she propped herself on her arm. Perhaps she was scrutinizing me. How I regretted that I could not see her eyes. I heard her deep breathing. Why did you come here? I asked her with a note of authority already in my voice. Oh, I don't know. But after all, how nice it would be to go on living in your own father's house. It's warm and free. You have a nest of your own. But what if it's worse than this? I must take the right tone, flashed through my mind. I may not get very far on sentimentality. But it was only a momentary thought. I swear she really did interest me. Besides, I was exhausted and moody, and after all, cunning so easily goes hand in hand with feeling. Who denies it? I hastened to answer. Anything may happen. I am, after all, convinced that someone has wronged you and is guiltier towards you than you towards them. After all, I know nothing of your story, but it's not likely a girl like you has come here of her own inclination. What kind of girl am I? She whispered, hardly audible, but I heard it. Damn it all, I was flattering her. That was abominable, but perhaps it was a good thing. She was silent. See, Lisa, I will tell you about myself. If I had had a home from childhood, I shouldn't be what I am now. I often think about that. After all, no matter how bad it may be at home, at least there are a father and a mother, and not enemies, strangers. Once a year, at least, they'll show their love for you. Anyway, you know you are at home. I grew up without a home, and perhaps that's why I've turned so unfeeling. I waited again. Perhaps she doesn't understand, I thought. And indeed, it is absurd, this moralizing. If I were a father and had a daughter, I believe I should love my daughter more than my sons, really. I began indirectly, as though talking of something else, in order to distract her attention. I confess I blushed. Why so? She asked. So she was listening. I don't know, Lisa. I knew a father who was a stern, strict man, but he used to go down on his knees to his daughter. He used to kiss her hands and feet. He couldn't make enough of her, really. When she danced at parties, he used to stand for 5 hours at a stretch without taking his eyes off her. He was mad about her. I understand that. She would fall asleep tired at night, and he would get up to kiss her in her sleep and make the sign of the cross over her. He would go about in a dirty old coat and was stingy to everyone. He would spend his last penny for her, giving her expensive presents, and it was a delight to him when she was pleased with what he gave her. Fathers always love their daughters more than mothers do. Some girls live happily at home, and I believe I would never let my daughter marry. I would be jealous, I really would, to think that she would kiss anyone else, that she would love a stranger more than her father. It's painful to imagine it. Of course, it's all nonsense. Of course, every father would be reasonable at last, but I believe before I would let her marry, I would worry myself to death. I would find faults with all her suitors, but I would end by letting her marry whom she loved most. After all, the one whom the daughter loves always seems the worst to the father. That is always so. So many families get into trouble with that. Some are glad to sell their daughters rather than to marry them honorably. So that was it. Such a thing, Lisa, happens in the most accursed families, in which there is neither love nor God, I retorted warmly. And where there is no love, there is no sense either. There are such families, it's true, but I am not speaking of them. You must have seen wickednesses in your own family, if you can talk like that. You must have been genuinely unlucky. That sort of thing mostly comes about through poverty. And is it any better among the rich? Even among the poor, honest people live happily. Yes, perhaps. Another thing, Lisa. Man only likes to count his troubles, but he does not count his joys. If he counted them up as he ought, he would see that every lot has enough happiness provided for it. And what if all goes well with the family, if the blessing of God is above it, if the husband is a good one, loves you, cherishes you, never leaves you? There is happiness in such a family. Sometimes there is happiness even in the midst of sorrow, and indeed, sorrow is everywhere. If you marry, you will find out for yourself. But think of the first years of married life with one you love. What happiness there sometimes is in it. And indeed, it's the ordinary thing. In those early days, even quarrels with one husband end happily. Some women get up more quarrels with their husbands the more they love them. Indeed, I knew a woman like that. She seemed to say that because she loved him deeply, she would torment him out of love so that he'd feel it. Do you know that you may torment a man on purpose out of love? Women are particularly given to that, thinking to themselves, I will love him so much afterwards, I will make so much of him, that it's no sin to torment him a little now. And everyone in the house rejoices in this sight of you. And you are happy and gay and peaceful and honorable. Then there are some women who are jealous if the husband goes off someplace. I knew one such woman. She could entertain himself, but would jump up at night and would run off on the side to find out where he was, whether he was with some other woman. That's already bad. But the woman knows herself it's wrong, and her heart fails her and she suffers. But after all, she loves. It's all through love. And how sweet it is to make up after quarrels, to admit she was wrong or to forgive him. And they are both so happy. All at once they become so happy, as though they had met anew, been married over again, as though their love had begun anew. And no one should know what passes between husband and wife if they love one another. And no matter how their quarrels ended, they ought not to call in even their own mothers to judge between them and tell tales of one another. They are their own judges. Love is a holy mystery, and ought to be hidden from all other eyes, no matter what happens. That makes it holier and better. They respect one another more. And much is built on respect, and if there has been love, if they have been married for love, why should love pass away? Surely one can keep it. It is rare that one cannot keep it. And if the husband is the kind and straightforward, why should love not last? The first phase of marriage, love. The first phase of married love will last, it is true, but then there will come a love that is better still. Then there will be a union of souls. They will have everything in common. There will be no secrets between them, and once they have children, the most difficult times will seem to them happy, so long as there is love and courage. Even toil will be a joy. You may deny yourself bread for your children, and even that will be a joy. After all, they will love you for it afterwards. So you are laying by for your future. As the children grow up, you feel that you are an example, a support for them, that even after you die, your children will cherish your thoughts and feelings because they have received them from you. They will take on your resemblance and likeness, so you will see it is a great duty. How can it fail to draw the father and mother closer? People say it's a trial to have children. Who says that? It is heavenly joy. Are you fond of little children, Lisa? I am awfully fond of them. You know, a little rosy baby boy at your bosom, and your husband's heart is not touched, seeing his wife nursing a child, a plump little rosy baby sprawling and snuggling, chubby little hands and feet. Clean, tiny little nails, so tiny that it makes one laugh to look at them, eyes that look as if they understand everything, and while it sucks, it clutches at your bosom with its tiny hands. Plays. When its father comes up, the child tears itself away from the bosom, flings itself back, looks at its father, laughs as though it were God knows how funny, and falls to sucking again. Or it will bite its mother's breasts when it is cutting its little teeth, while it looks sideways at her with its little eyes, as though to say, "Look, I'm biting." Is not all that a joy? When there are all three together, husband, wife, and child, one can forgive a great deal for the sake of such moments. Yes, Lisa, one must first learn to live oneself before one blames others. It's by pictures like that one must get at you. I thought to myself, though I did not speak with real feeling, and all at once I flushed crimson. What if she were suddenly to burst out laughing? What would I do then? The eye drove me to a fury. Towards the end of my speech I was really excited, and now my vanity was somehow wounded. The silence continued. I almost wanted to nudge her. "Why are you—" she began and stopped. But I understood. There was a quiver of something different in her voice, not abrupt, harsh, and unyielding as before, but something soft and shamefaced. So shamefaced that I suddenly felt ashamed and guilty. "What?" I asked with tender curiosity. "Why, you—" "What?" "Why, you speak exactly like a book," she said, and something sarcastic was heard in her voice. That remark sent a pang to my heart. It was not what I was expecting. I did not expect that she was hiding her feelings by sarcasm, and that this is usually the last refuge of a modest and chaste-souled people when the privacy of their soul is coarsely, intrusively invaded, and that their pride makes them refuse to surrender to the last moment and shrink from expressing their feelings. I ought to have guessed this truth from the timidity of which she had a number of times attempted her sarcasm, only bringing herself to utter it at last with an effort. But I did not guess, and a spiteful feeling took possession of me. Wait a bit, I thought. Chapter 7. "Oh, hush, Lisa, how can you talk about my speaking like a book when it makes even me, an outsider, feel sick? Though I don't look at it as an outsider, for indeed all that has touched me to the heart. Is it possible that you do not feel sick at being here yourself? Evidently habit does wonders. God knows what habit can do with anyone. Can you really and seriously think that you will never grow old, that you will always be good-looking, and that they will keep you here forever and ever? I say nothing of the filth here. Let me tell you this about it, about your present life, I mean. Even though you are young now, attractive, nice with soul and feeling, yet, you know, as soon as I come to myself just now, I felt at once sick at being here with you. After all, one can only come here when one is drunk. But if you were anywhere else, living as decent people live, I would perhaps be more than attracted to you. I would fall in love with you, would be glad of a look from you, let alone a word. I could hang about your door, would go down on my knees to you. We would become engaged, and I would even consider it an honor to do so. I would not dare to have an impure thought about you. But here, after all, I know that I have only to whistle, and you have to come to me, whether you like it or not. I don't consult your wishes, but you mine. The lowest laborer hires himself as a workman, but he doesn't make a slave of himself altogether. Besides, he knows that he will be free again. But when will you be free? Only think what you are giving up here. What is it that you are making a slave of? Is it your soul together with your body? You are selling your soul, which you have no right to dispose of. You give your love to be outraged by every drunkard. Love, but after all, That's everything. But after all, it's a jewel. It's a maiden's treasure, love. Why, after all, a man would be ready to give you his soul, to face death and gain your love. But how much is your love worth now? You can be bought, all of you, body and soul, and there is no need to strive for love when you can have everything without love. And after all, there is no greater insult for a girl than that. Do you understand? To be sure, I have heard that they comfort you. Poor fools, they let you have lovers of your own here. But after all, that's simply a farce. That's simply a sham. It's just laughing at you, and you are taken in by it. Why, do you suppose he really loves you, that lover of yours? I don't believe it. How can he love you when he knows that you may be called away from him any minute? He would be a vile fellow if he did. Would he have a grain of respect for you? Would you have in common with him? What have you in common with him? He laughs at you and robs you. That is all his love amounts to. You are lucky if he does not beat you. Very lucky. Very likely he does beat you too. Ask him, if you have one, whether he will marry you. He will laugh in your face if he doesn't spit in it or give you a blow, yet he might not be worth a pluggered nickel himself. And for what have you ruined your life, if you come to think of it? For the coffee they give you to drink and the plentiful meals? But after all, why do they feed you? An honest girl couldn't swallow the food. She would know why she was being fed. You are in debt here, and of course you will always be in debt. You will go on in debt till the end, till the visitor here begin to scorn you, and that will soon happen. Don't rely upon your youth. All that flies by like an express train here after all. You will be kicked out, and not simply kicked out, long before they begin to snag you. Long before that, they will begin to snag you, scold you, abuse you, as though you had not sacrificed your health for her, had not ruined your youth and your soul for her benefit, but as though you had ruined her, ravaged her, robbed her, and don't expect anyone to take your part. The others, your companions, will attack you too, to win her favor, for all are in slavery here, and have lost all conscience and pity long ago. They have begun utterly vile, and nothing on earth is viler, more loathsome, and more insulting than their abuse. And you are laying down everything here, everything unconditionally, youth and health and beauty and health, and at 22 you will look like a woman of 35, and you will be lucky if you are not diseased. Pray to God for that. No doubt you are thinking now, after all, that you have a lark and no work to do. Yet there is no harder or more dreadful work in the world or ever has been. One would think that the heart alone would be worn out with tears. And you don't dare say a word, not half a word, when they drive you away from here. You will go away as though you were to blame. You will charge to another house, then to a third, and somewhere else, till you come down at last to the Haymarket. There you will be beaten at every turn. That is a courtesy there. The visitors there don't know how to be friendly without beating you. And don't believe that it is so hateful there. Go on and look for yourself some time and come see with your own eyes. Once, on New Year's Day, I saw a woman at the door. Her own kind had turned her out as a joke to give her a taste of the frost because she had been howling too much, and they shut the door behind her. At 9 o'clock in the morning she was already completely drunk, disheveled, half naked, covered with bruises. Her face was powdered, but she had a black eye. Blood was trickling from her nose and her teeth. Some cabman had just beaten her. She was sitting on the stone step. A salt fish of some sort was in her hand. She was howling, wailing something about her fate, and beating with a fish on the steps. The cabman and the drunken soldiers were crowding on the doorway, taunting her. And you don't believe you will ever be like that? I would not like to believe it either, but how do you know? Maybe 10 years, 8 years ago, that very woman with that salt fish came here fresh as a little cherub, innocent, pure, knowing no evil, blushing at every word. Perhaps she was like you, proud, ready to take offense. Not like the others. Perhaps she too looked like a queen and knew what happiness was in store for the man who would love her and whom she would love. Do you see how it ended? And what if at that very minute when she was beating on the filthy steps with that fish, drunken and disheveled, what if that very minute she recalled the pure early days in her father's house when she used to go to school and her neighbor's son watched for her on the way, declaring that he would love her as long as he lived, that he would devote his life to her, and when they vowed to love one another forever and be married as soon as they were grown up. No, Lisa, it would be a joy for you. A joy if you were to die soon of consumption in some corner, in some cellar like that woman just now. In some hospital, do you say? Will you be lucky if they take you? But what if you are still of use to Madam here? Consumption is a queer disease. It is not like fever. The patient goes on hoping to the last minute and says he is all right. He deludes himself. And that's just advantageous for your madam. Don't doubt it. That's how it is. You have sold your soul, and what is more, you owe money. So you don't even dare say a word. But when you are dying, everyone will abandon you. Everyone will turn away from you. From then, there will be nothing to get from you. What's more, they will still reproach you for taking up space, for taking so long to die. You won't even be able to beg for a drink of water without getting abuse. Aren't you going to die, you foul wench? Why won't you let us sleep with your moaning? You make the gentleman sick. That's true. I have heard such things myself. When you are really dying, they will push you into the filthiest corner in the cellar, in the damp and darkness. What will your thoughts be, lying there alone? When you die, strange hands will lay you out, and grumbling with impatience, no one will bless you. No one will sigh for you. They will only want to get rid of you as soon as possible. They will buy a coffin, take you to the grave as they did that poor woman today, and celebrate your memory at the tavern. There is slush, filth, wet snow in the grave. No need to put someone else out for you. Let her down, Venyuka. It's just like her fate, after all. Here she goes, head first, the wench. Shorten the cord, you rascal. It's all right as it is. All right, is it? Why, she's on her side. Wasn't she a human being too? Well, never mind, cover her up. And they won't care to waste much time quarreling over you. They will scatter the wet blue clay as quickly as they can and go off to the tavern, and there your memory on earth will end. Other women have children who visit their graves, fathers, husbands, while for you there will be neither tear, nor sigh, nor remembrance. No one in the whole world will ever come to you. Your name will vanish from the face of the earth as though you had never existed, had never been born at all. Nothing but filth and mud, no matter how much you knock on your coffin lid at night when the dead arise. However you cry, "Let me out, kind people, to live in the light of day. My life was no life at all. My life has been thrown away like a dirty rag. It was drunk away in the tavern in the Haymarket. Let me out, kind people, to live in the world again." And I worked myself up to such a pitch that I began to have a lump in my throat myself, and suddenly I stopped, sat up in dismay, and bending over apprehensively, began to listen with a beating heart. I had reason to be worried. I felt for some time that I was turning her soul upside down and breaking her heart, and the more I was convinced of it, the more I wanted to gain my end as quickly and effectively as possible. The sport attracted me. Yet it was not merely the sport. I knew I was speaking stiffly, artificially, even bookishly. In short, I did not know how to speak except just like a book. And that did not bother me. After all, I knew, I felt, and I would be understood, and that this very bookishness would perhaps even be a help. But now, having achieved my effect, I was suddenly panic-stricken. No, I had never before witnessed such despair. She was lying face down, pressed her face deep into the pillow and clutching it in both hands. Her heart was being torn. Her youthful body was shuddering all over as though in convulsion. Suppressed sobs rent her bosom and suddenly burst out in weeping and wailing. Then she suddenly pressed even deeper in the pillow. She did not want anyone here, not a single living soul, to know of her anguish and her tears. She bit the pillow, bit her hand till it bled. I saw that afterward. Or, thrusting her fingers into her disheveled hair, seemed rigid with the efforts to restrain herself. Holding her breath and clenching her teeth, I began to say something to her, to beg her to calm herself, but felt that I did not dare, and suddenly, all in a sort of chill, almost in a terror, began fumbling in the dark, trying hurriedly to get dressed to go. It was dark. Try as I would, I could not finish dressing quickly. Suddenly I felt a box of matches and a candlestick with a whole new candle in it. As soon as the room was lighted up, Lisa sprang up, sat up in bed, and with a contorted face, with a half-insane smile, looked at me almost senselessly. I sat down beside her and took her hand. She came to herself, made a movement toward me, would have clasped me, but did not dare, and slowly bowed her head before me. "Lisa, my dear, I was wrong to... Forgive me," I began, but she squeezed my hand in her fingers so tightly that I felt I was saying the wrong thing, and stopped. "This is my address, Lisa. Come to me." "I will come," she whispered resolutely, her head still bowed. "But now I am going. Goodbye. Till we meet again." I got up. She too stood up and suddenly flushed all over, shuddered, snatched up her shawl that was lying on a chair and muffled herself in it to her chin. And as she did this, she gave another sickly smile, blushed and looked at me strangely. I felt wretched. I was in haste to get away, to disappear. "Wait a minute," she said suddenly, in the passage just at the doorway, stopping me with her hand on my overcoat. She put down the candle hastily and ran off. Evidently, she had thought of something, or wanted to show me something. As she ran away, she flushed, her eyes shone, and a smile appeared on her lips. What was the meaning of it? Against my will, I waited. She came back a minute later with an expression that seemed to ask forgiveness for something. In fact, it was not the same face that it had been before, a sudden, mistrustful, and obstinate. Her look was now imploring, soft, and at the same time trustful, caressing, timid. Children look that way at people they are very fond of whom they are asking a favor. Her eyes were a light hazel. They were lovely eyes, full of life, capable of expressing love as well as sullen hatred, making no explanation, as though I, as a sort of higher being, must understand everything without explanation. She held out a piece of paper to me. Her whole face was positively beaming at that instant with naive, almost childish triumph. I unfolded it. It was a letter to her from a medical student or someone of that sort, a very high-flown and flowery, but extremely respectful declaration of love. I don't recall the words now, but I remember well enough that through the high-flown phrases there was apparent a genuine feeling which cannot be feigned. When I had finished reading it, I met her glowing, questioning and childishly impatient eyes fixed upon me. She fastened her eyes upon my face and waited impatiently for what I would say. In a few words, hurriedly, but with a sort of joy and pride, she explained to me that she had been to a dance somewhere in a private house at some very, very nice people's house, a family who still know nothing, absolutely nothing, for she had only come here so lately, and it had all happened. And she hadn't made up her mind to stay, and was certainly going away as soon as she had paid her debt. And at that party there had been that student who had danced with her the whole evening, had talked to her, and it turned out that he had known her in the old days at Riga when he was a child. They had played together, but a very long time ago. And he knew her parents, but about this he knew nothing. Nothing whatsoever, and had no suspicion. And the day after the dance, 3 days ago, he had sent her that letter through a friend with whom she had gone to the party, and, well, that was all. She dropped her shining eyes with a sort of bashfulness as she finished. The poor girl was keeping that student's letter as a treasure, and had run to fetch it, her only treasure, because she did not want me to go away without knowing that she, too, was honestly and genuinely loved, that she, too, was addressed respectfully. No doubt that letter was destined to lie in her box and lead to nothing. But it doesn't matter. I am certain that she would guard it like a treasure all her life, as her pride and justification. And now at such a minute she had thought of that letter and brought it with that naive pride to raise herself in my eyes, that I might see, that I, too, might think a well of her. I said nothing, pressed her hand and went out. I so longed to get away. I walked home all the way in spite of the fact that the wet snow was still falling in large flakes. I was exhausted, shattered, in bewilderment. But behind the bewilderment, the truth was already gleaming. The loathsome truth. Chapter 8. A toast, if anybody's made it this far in one sitting. Toast. Hell yeah. Oh, pardon my language. Heck yeah, Earl Grey. Chapter 8. Dostoyevsky's Notes from Underground. It was some time, however, before I consented to recognize that truth. Waking up in the morning after some hours of heavy, laden sleep and immediately realizing all that had happened on the previous day, I was positively amazed at my last night's sentimentality with Lisa, at all the horrors of pity of yesterday. After all, to have had such an attack of womanish hysteria. Pah! I concluded, and why did I force my address upon her? What if she comes? Let her come, though. It is all right. But obviously that was not now the chief and most important matter. I had to make haste, and at all costs, save my reputation in the eyes of Sverkov and Simonov as quickly as possible. That was the chief business, and I was so taken up that morning that I actually forgot all about Lisa. First of all, I had to repay at once what I had borrowed the day before from Simonov. I resolved on a desperate course to borrow 15 rubles from Anton Antonich. As luck would have it, he was in the best of humors that morning, and gave it to me at once as soon as I asked. I was so delighted at this that I signed the IOU with a swaggering air. I told him casually that the night before I had been making merry with some friends at the Hôtel de Paris. We were giving a farewell party to a comrade. In fact, I might say a friend of my childhood, and a desperate rake, spoiled, of course. He belongs to a good family. He has considerable means, a brilliant career, he is witty, charming, carries on affairs with certain ladies, you understand. We drank an extra half a case, and after all it went off all right. All this was said very lightly, unconstrainedly, and complacently. On returning home, I promptly wrote to Simonov. To this hour, I am lost in admiration when I recall the truly gentlemanly, good-humored, candid tone of my letter. With tact and good taste, and above all, entirely without superfluous words, I blamed myself for all that had happened. I defended myself, if only may still be able to defend myself, by alleging that, being utterly unaccustomed to wine, I had been intoxicated by the first glass, which, I claimed, I had drunk before they arrived. While I was waiting for them at the Hotel de Paris between 5 and 6 o'clock, I particularly begged Simonov's pardon. I asked him also to convey my explanations to all the others, especially to Zverkov, whom I remembered as though in a dream. I seemed to have insulted. I added that I would have called upon all of them myself, but that my head ached, and that besides, I was rather ashamed. I was especially pleased with that certain lightness, almost carelessness, strictly within the bounds of politeness, however, which was suddenly reflected in my style, and better than any possible arguments, gave them at once to understanding that I took rather an independent view of all that unpleasantness last night. That I was by no means so utterly crushed as you gentlemen probably imagine, but on the contrary, that I looked at it as a gentleman serenely respecting himself should. On a young hero's past no censor is cast. There is, after all, even an aristocratic playfulness about it. I thoughtfully admired as I read over the latter, and it's all because I am a cultured and educated man. Others in my place would not have known how to extricate themselves, but here I have gotten out of it, and am as gay as ever, and all because I am a cultured and educated man of our day. And indeed, perhaps everything really was due to the wine yesterday. Well, no, it was not the wine. I drank nothing at all between 5 and 6, as I was waiting for them. I had lied to Simonov, lied shamelessly, and even now I wasn't ashamed. Hang it all, though. The important thing was that I was rid of it. I spent 6 roubles in the letter, sealed it up, and asked Apollon to take it to Simonov. When he learned that there was money on the letter, Apollon became more respectful and agreed to take it. Toward evening, I went out for a walk. My head was still aching and giddy after yesterday, but as evening came on and the twilight grew thicker, my impressions changed and grew more and more confused, and after them, my thoughts. Something was not dead within me. In the depths of my heart and conscience it would not die, and it expressed itself as a burning anguish. For the most part, I jostled my way through the most crowded business streets, along Mechkensky Street, along Sadovy Street, and in the Yusupov Garden. I always particularly like to stroll along those streets at dusk, just when they become more crowded with people of all sorts, merchants and artisans going home from their day's work, with faces looking maliciously out of anxiety. What I liked was just that cheap bustle, that bare, humdrum, prosaic quality. On this occasion, all that bustling in the street irritated me more than ever. I could not make out what was wrong with me, could not find the clue. Something was rising up continually in my soul, painfully, and refusing to be appeased. I returned home completely upset. It was just as though some crime were lying on my conscience. The thought that Lisa was coming worried me continually. It It seemed queer to me of all yesterday's memories, the memories of her tormenting me, as it were, particularly, quite separately, as it were. I had succeeded in forgetting everything else by evening time. I dismissed it all and was perfectly satisfied with my letter to Semyonov. But on this point I was not satisfied at all. It is not as though I was worried only by Lisa. What if she comes? I thought incessantly. Well, so what? It's all right. Let her come. It's horrid what she should see how I live, for instance. Yesterday I seemed such a hero to her, while now... It's horrid, though, and I have to let myself sink so low. This room looks like a beggar's, and I brought myself to go out to dinner in such a suit. My oilcloth sofa, with the stuffing thick sticking out, and my robe, which will not cover me. What tatters! And she will see all this, and she will see Apollon. That beast is certain to insult her. He will fasten upon her in order to be rude to me, and I, of course, will be panic-stricken as usual. I will begin to bow and scrape before her, and to pull my robe around me. I will begin to smile, to lie. Oh, how foul! And it isn't the foulness of it that matters most. There is something more important, more loathsome, viler. Yes, viler, and to put on a dishonest lying mask again. When I reached that thought, I flared up all at once. Why dishonest? How dishonest? I was speaking sincerely last night. I remember there was real feeling in me, too. What I wanted was to awake noble feelings in her. Her crying was a good thing. It will have a good effect. Yet I could not feel at ease. All that evening, even when I had come back home, even after 9 o'clock, when I calculated that Lisa would not possibly come, she still haunted me. And what was worse, she always came back to my mind in the same position. One moment out of all that had happened last night presented itself before me vividly, the moment when I struck a match and saw her pale, distorted face with its tortured look. And what a pitiful look! What an unnatural, what a distorted smile she had at that moment. But I did not know then that even 15 years later, I would still always picture Lisa to myself with that pitiful, distorted, inappropriate smile which was on her face at that moment. Next day, I was ready again to look upon it all as nonsense, due to overexcited nerves, and above all as exaggerated. I always recognized that as a weak point of mine, and was sometimes very much afraid of it. I exaggerate everything. That is where I go wrong, I repeated to myself every hour. But nevertheless, Lisa will likely come still. Nevertheless, was the refrain with which all my reflections ended then. I was so uneasy that I sometimes flew into a fury. She'll come. She is certain to come, I cried, running into the room. If not today, she will come tomorrow. She will seek me out. The damnable romanticism of these pure hearts. Oh, the vileness. Oh, the silliness. Oh, the stupidity of these wretched sentimental souls. Why, how could one fail to understand? How could one possibly fail to understand? But at this point I stopped short, and even in great confusion. And how few words, I thought in passing, were needed. How little of the idyllic, and affectedly, bookishly, artificially idyllic too, had sufficed to turn a whole human life at once according to my will. That's insolence for you. That's virgin soil for you. At times the thought occurred to me to go to her, to tell her all, to beg her not to come to me. But this thought stirred such wrath in me that I believed I should have crushed that damned Lisa if she had happened to be near me at the time. I should have insulted her, have spat on her, have turned her out, have struck her. One day passed, however, a second and a third. She did not come, and I began to grow calmer. I felt particularly bold and cheerful after 9 o'clock. I even began sometimes to dream, and rather sweetly. I, for instance, became the salvation of Lisa, simply through her coming to me and my talking to her. I develop her, educate her. Finally, I notice that she loves me passionately. I pretend not to understand. I don't know, however, why I pretend, just for effect, perhaps. At last, all confusion, beautiful, trembling, and sobbing, she flings herself at my feet and tells me I am her savior, and she loves me better than anything in the world. I am amazed. But, Lisa, I say, can you really believe that I have noticed your love? I saw it all before. I divined it. But I did not dare to approach you first, because I had an influence over you and was afraid that you would force yourself, out of gratitude, to respond to my love, would try to arouse in your heart a feeling which was perhaps absent, and I did not wish that, because it would be tyranny. It would be indelicate. In short, I launch at that point into European, inexplicably lofty subtleties, a la George Sand. But now you are mine. You are my creation. You are pure. You are beautiful. You are my beautiful life. And into my house come bold and free, its rightful mistress there to be. Then we begin to live together happily, go abroad, etc., etc. In short, in the end, it seems vulgar to me myself, and I begin to put out my tongue at myself. And besides, they won't let her out. The hussy, I thought. After all, they won't let her go out very readily, especially in the evening. For some reason, I fancied she would have to come in the evening, and precisely at 7 o'clock. Though she did say she was not altogether a slave there yet, and had certain rights. So, damn it all, she will come. She is sure to come. It is a good thing, in fact, that Apollon distracted my attention that time by his rudeness. He drove me beyond all patience. He was the bane of my life, the curse laid upon me by Providence. We have been squabbling continually for years, and I hated him. By God, how I hated him! I believe I have never hated anyone in my life as I hated him, especially at some moments. He was an elderly, dignified man who worked part of his time as a tailor. But for some unknown reason, he despised me beyond all measure, and looked down upon me insufferably, though indeed he looked down upon everyone. Simply to glance at that flaxen, smoothly brushed head, at the tuft of hair he combed up on his forehead and oiled with sunflower oil, at that dignified mouth, always pursed, made one to feel one was confronting a man who never doubted himself. He was an insufferable pedant, the greatest pedant I had ever met with, and with that head of vanity only befitting Alexander the Great. He was in love with every button on his coat, every nail on his fingers, absolutely in love with them, and he looked it. In his behavior to me, he was an absolute tyrant, spoke very little of me, and if he chanced to glance at me, he gave me a firm, majestically self-confident, and invariably ironical look that sometimes drove me to a fury. He did his work with the air of doing me the greatest favor, though he did scarcely anything for me, and did not indeed consider himself obliged to do anything. There could be no doubt that he looked upon me as the greatest fool on earth, and that the reasons he did not get rid of me was simply that he could get wages from me every month. He consented to do nothing for me for 7 roubles a month. Many sins should be given me for what I suffered from him. My hatred reached such a point that sometimes his very walk almost threw me into convulsions. What I loathed particularly was his lisp. His tongue must have been a little too long, or something of that sort, for he continually lisped. He seemed to be very proud of it, imagining that it greatly added to his dignity. He spoke in a slow, measured tone, with his hands behind his back and his eyes fixed on the ground. He maddened me particularly when he read his psalms aloud to himself behind his partition. I waged many a battle over that reading, but he was awfully fond of reading aloud in the evening, in a slow, even, chanting voice, as though over the dead. It is interesting that he ended up that way. He hires himself out to read the psalms over the dead, and at the same time he kills rats and makes shoe polish, and at that time I could not get rid of him. It is as though we were chemically combined with my existence. Besides, nothing would ever induce him to consent to leave me. I could not live in a furnished room. My apartment was my privacy, my shell, my cave, in which I concealed myself from all mankind, and Apollon seemed to me, God only knows why, an integral part of that apartment, and for 7 whole years I could not get rid of him. For example, to be 2 or 3 days late with his wages was impossible. He would have made such a fuss I would not have known where to hide my head, but I was so exasperated with everything during that period that I made up my mind for some reason with some object to punish Apollon and not pay him for a fortnight the wages I owed him. I intended to do this for a long time, for the last 2 years, simply in order to teach him not to give himself airs with me, and to show him that if I liked I could withhold his wages. I decided to say nothing to him about it, and even to be silent purposely, in order to conquer his pride, and force him to be the first to speak of his wages. Then I would take my 7 roubles out of a drawer, show him I have the money, and have put it aside purposely, but that I simply don't want to pay him his wages. I don't want to, just because it's what I want. Because I am master, and it is for me to decide. Because he has been disrespectful, because he is a ruffian. But if he were to ask respectfully, I might be softened and give it to him. Otherwise, he might wait another fortnight, another 3 weeks, a whole month. But no matter how angry I was, he always got the better of me. I could not even hold out for 4 days. He began, as he always began such cases, for there had been such cases already. There had been attempts, and it may be observed, I knew all this beforehand. I knew his nasty tactics by heart. To wit, he would begin by fixing upon me an exceedingly severe stare, keeping it up for several minutes at a time, particularly on meeting me or seeing me out of the house. If I held out and pretended not to notice these stares, he would, still in silence, proceed to further tortures. All at once, for no reason at all, he would softly and smoothly walk into my room when I was pacing up and down, or reading, stand at the door, one hand behind his back and one foot forward, and fix upon me a stare, more than severe, utterly contemptuous. If I suddenly asked him what he wanted, he would not answer, but continued to stare at me persistently for some seconds longer. Then, with a particular compression of his lips, and with a very significant air, deliberately turn around, and deliberately go back to his room. 2 hours later, he would come out again, and again present himself before me in the same way. It has happened that, in my fury, I did not even ask him what he wanted, but simply raised my head sharply and imperiously and began staring back at him. So we stared at one another for 2 minutes, and at last he turned with deliberation and dignity and went back again for 2 hours. If I were still not brought to reason by all this, but persisted in my revolt, he would suddenly begin sighing, while he looked at me, long, deep sighs, as though measuring by them the depths of my moral degradation. And, of course, it ended at last by his triumphantly completing. I raged and shouted, but was still forced to do what he wanted. This time The usual maneuvers of severe staring had scarcely begun when I lost my temper and flew at him in a fury. I was irritated beyond endurance even without him. "Wait!" I shouted in a frenzy as he was slowly and silently turning with one hand behind his back to go to his room. "Wait! Come back, I tell you!" And I must have bowled so unnaturally that he turned round and even looked at me with a certain amazement. However, he persisted in saying nothing, and that infuriated me. "How dare you come and look at me like that without being sent for? Answer!" And looking at me calmly for half a minute, he began turning around again. "Wait!" I roared, running up to him. "Don't stir! There! Answer! Now! Why did you come in to look at?" "If you have any order to give me at this moment, it is my duty to carry it out," he answered after another silent pause with a slow, measured lisp, raising his eyebrows and calmly twisting his head from one side to another. All this with exasperating composure. "That's not it. That's not what I'm asking you about, you torturer," I shouted, shaking with anger. "I'll tell you myself, you torturer, why you came here. You see, I don't give you your wages. You are so proud you don't want to bow down and ask for it, so you have to come to punish me with your stupid stares, to torture me. And you have no suspicion, you torturer, how stupid it is. Stupid, stupid, stupid!" He would have turned around again without a word, but I seized him. "Listen," I shouted to him. "Here's the money. Do you see? Here it is." I took it out of the table drawer. "Here's the whole 7 rubles, but you are not going to have it. You are not going to have it until you come respectfully with bowed head to beg my pardon. Do you hear?" "That cannot be," he answered with the most unnatural self-confidence. "It will be so," I said. "I give you my word of honor, it will be." There's nothing for me to beg your pardon for," he went on as though he had not noticed my exclamations at all. "Why, beside, you call me a torturer, for which I can assume you have at the police station at any time for insulting behavior." "Go, summon me," I roared. "Go at once this very minute, this very second. You are a torturer all the same, a torturer, a torturer." But he merely looked at me, then turned, and regardless of my loud calls to him, he walked out of his room with an even step and without looking around. If it had not been for Lisa, nothing of this would have happened, I decided inwardly. Then, after waiting a minute, I myself went behind the screen with a dignified and solemn air, though my heart was beating slowly and violently. "Poland," I said quietly and emphatically, though I was breathless. "Go at once without a minute's delay and fetch the police officer." He had meanwhile settled himself at his table, put on his spectacles, and taken up something to tailor. But hearing my order, he burst into a guffaw. "At once! Go this minute! Go on, or else you can't imagine what will happen." "You are certainly not in your right mind, sir," he observed, even without raising his head, lisping as deliberately as ever and threading his needle. "Who ever heard of a man sending for a police against himself? And as for being frightened, you are upsetting yourself about nothing, for nothing will come of it." "Go!" I shrieked, grabbing him by the collar. I felt that in another minute I would hit him. But I did not notice that suddenly the door from the passage softly and slowly opened, and that instant and a figure came in, stopped short, and began staring in amazement. I glanced, nearly died with shame, and rushed back to my room. There, clutching at my hair with both hands, I leaned my head against the wall and stood motionless in that position. 2 minutes later, I heard Apollin's deliberate footsteps. "There is some woman asking for you," he said, looking at me with peculiar severity. Then he stood aside and let in Lisa. He would not go away, but stared at us sarcastically. "Go away, go away," I commanded in desperation. At that moment, my clock began whirring and wheezing and struck 7. Chapter 9 of Part 2 of Dostoyevsky's Notes from Underground. "And into my house come bold and free, its rightful mistress there to be." From the same poetic work. I stood before her crushed, crestfallen, revoltingly embarrassed, and I believe I smiled as I did my utmost to wrap myself in the skirts of my ragged, warded robe, just exactly as I had imagined the scene not long before in a fit of depression. After standing over us for a couple of minutes, Apollon went away, but that did not make me more comfortable. What made it worse was that suddenly she too became embarrassed, more so in fact than I would have expected, at the sight of me, of course. "Sit down," I said mechanically, moving a chair up to the table, and I sat down on the sofa. She obediently sat down at once and gazed at me open-eyed, evidently expecting something from me at once. This naivety of expectation drove me to fury, but I restrained myself. She ought to have tried not to have noticed, as though everything had been usual, while instead she... And I dimly felt that I would make her pay dearly for all this. "You have found me in a strange position, Lisa," I began, stammering and knowing that this was the wrong way to begin. No, don't imagine anything," I cried, seeing that she had suddenly flushed. "I am not ashamed of my poverty. On the contrary, I look on my poverty with pride. I am poor, but honorable. One can be poor and honorable," I muttered. "However, would you like tea?" "No," she was beginning. "Wait a minute." I leapt up and ran to Apollon. I had to get out of the room somehow. "Apollon," I whispered in a feverish haste, flinging down before him the 7 roubles which had remained all the time in my clenched fist. "Here are your wages. You see, I gave them to you. But for that, you must come to my rescue. Bring me tea and a dozen rusks from the restaurant. If you won't go, you'll make a man miserable. You don't know what this woman is. This is everything. You may be imagining something, but you don't know what a woman she is." Apollon, who had already sat down to his work and put on his spectacles again, at first glanced askance at the money without speaking or putting down his needle. Then, without paying the slightest attention to me or making any move, he went on busying himself with his needle, which he had not yet threaded. I waited before him for several minutes with my arm crossed à la Napoleon. My temples were moist with sweat. I was pale. I felt it. But, thank God, he must have been moved to pity looking at me. Having threaded his needle, he deliberately got up from his desk, deliberately moved back his chair, deliberately took off his spectacles, deliberately counted the money, and finally asking me over his shoulder, "Shall I get a whole pot?" Deliberately I walked out of the room. As I was going back to Lisa, the thought occurred to me on the way. Shouldn't I run away just as I was in my robe, no matter where, and let come what may? I sat down again. She looked at me uneasily. For some minutes we were silent. "I will kill him," I shouted suddenly, striking the table with my fists so that ink spurted out of the inkstand. "What are you saying?" she cried, starting. "I will kill him! Kill him!" I shrieked, suddenly striking the table, the absolute fury and frenzy. and at the same time fully understanding how stupid it was to be in such a frenzy. You don't know, Lisa, what that torturer is to me. He is my torturer. He has gone to fetch some rusks. And suddenly I burst into tears. I was in hysteria. How ashamed I felt in the midst of my sobs, but still I could not restrain them. She was frightened. "What's the matter? What is wrong?" she shrieked, fussing around me. "Water! Give me water! Over there!" I muttered in a faint voice, although I was inwardly conscious that I could easily have done without water and without muttering in a faint voice. But I was what is called putting it on to save appearance, though the attack was a genuine one. She gave me water, looked at me in bewilderment. At that moment, Apollon brought in the tea. It suddenly seemed to me that this commonplace and prosaic tea was terribly undignified and paltry after all that had happened, and I blushed. Lisa even looked at Apollon with alarm. He went out without a glance at us. "Lisa, do you despise me?" I asked, looking at her fixedly, trembling with impatience to know what she was thinking. She was embarrassed and did not know what to answer. "Drink your tea," I said to her angrily. I was angry with myself, but of course it was she who would have to pay for it. A horrible spite against her suddenly surged up in my heart. I believed I could have killed her. To revenge myself on her, I swore inwardly not to say a word to her all the time. She is the cause of this, I thought. Our silence lasted for 5 minutes. The tea stood on the table. We did not touch it. I had got to the point of purposely refraining from beginning to drink in order to embarrass her further. It was awkward for her to begin alone. Several times she glanced at me with mournful perplexity. I was obstinately silent. I was, of course, myself the chief sufferer, because I was fully conscious of the disgusting meanness of my spiteful stupidity, and yet at the same time, I absolutely could not refrain myself. "I want to get away from here altogether," she began to break the silence in some way, but poor girl, that was just what she ought not to have spoken about at such a moment. Stupid enough, even without that, to a man so stupid as I was. My heart positively ached with pity for her tactless and unnecessary straightforwardness. But something hideous at once stifled all compassion in me. It even provoked me to greater venom. Let the whole world go to pot. Another 5 minutes passed. "Perhaps I am in your way," she began timidly, hardly audible as I was getting up. But as soon as I saw this first impulse of wounded dignity, I positively trembled with spite, and at once burst out. "Why did you come to me? Tell me that, please," I began, gasping for breath, and regardless of all logic connection in my words. I longed to have it all out at once, at one burst. I did not even trouble how to begin. "Why did you come? Answer, answer," I cried, hardly knowing what I was doing. "I'll tell you, my good girl, why you came. You came because I talked fine sentiments to you then. So now you are soft as butter and longing for fine sentiments again. So you may as well know that I was laughing at you then. And I am laughing at you now. Why are you shuddering? Yes, I was laughing at you. I had been insulted just before, at dinner, by the fellows who came that evening before me. I came to you, meaning to thrash one of them, an officer, but I didn't succeed. I didn't find him. I had to avenge his insult on someone to get my own way back again. You turned up. I vented my spleen on you and laughed at you. I had been humiliated, so I wanted to humiliate. I had been treated like a rag, so I wanted to show my power. That's what it was. And you imagined I had come there on purpose to save you, didn't you? Did you imagine that? Did you imagine that?" I knew that she would perhaps get muddled and not grasp all the details, but I knew, too, that she would grasp the gist of it very well. And so, indeed, she did. She turned white as a handkerchief, tried to say something. It distorted her mouth painfully, but she sank in the chair as though she had been felled by an axe. And all the time afterward she listened to me with her lips parted and her eyes wide open, shuddering with awful terror. The cynicism of my words overwhelmed her. "Save you," I went on, jumping up from my chair and running up and down the room before her. "Save you from what? But perhaps I am worse than you myself. Why didn't you throw it in my teeth when I was giving you that sermon? But you, what did you come here for yourself? Was it to read us a sermon? Power? Power was what I wanted then. Sport was what I wanted. I wanted to wring out your tears, your humiliation, your hysteria. That is what I wanted then. After all, I couldn't keep it up then because I am a wretch. I was frightened, and the devil knows why, gave you my address in my folly. Afterwards, before I got home, I was cursing and swearing at you because of that address. I hated you already because of the lies I had told you, because I only liked to play with words, to dream in my mind. But do you know what I really want is that you would all go to hell. That is what I want. I want peace. Yes, I'd sell the whole world for a farthing right now, so long as I was left in peace. Is the world to go to pot, or am I to go without my tea? I say let the world go to pot as long as I get my tea every time. Do you know that, or not? Well, anyway, I know that I am a blackguard, a scoundrel, an egotist, a sluggard. Here I have been shuddering for at least 3 days at the thought of your coming, and do you know what has worried me particularly these 3 days? That I posed as such a hero to you then, and now you would see me in a wretched torn robe, a beggar, an abomination. I told you just now that I was not ashamed of my poverty. You may as well know that I am ashamed of it. I am more ashamed of it than of anything, more afraid of it than of being found out as if I were a thief, because I am as vain as though I had been skinned and the very air blowing on me hurt. Surely, but now even you must have realized that I will never forgive you for having found me in this wretched robe, just as I was flying into Apollon like that spiteful sheepdog at his lackey, and that lackey was jeering at him. I shall never forgive you for the tears I could not help shedding before you just now, like some silly woman put to shame, and for you, and for what I am confessing to you now, I shall never forgive you either. Yes, you must answer for all it, because you turned up like this, because I am a blackguard, because I am the nastiest, stupidest, pitiest, absurdest, and most envious of all worms on earth, none of whom is a bit better than I am, but who, the devil only knows why, are never embarrassed. Well, I will always be insulted by every louse. That is my doom. And what is it to me that you don't understand a word of this? What do I care? What do I care about you, and whether you go to ruin there or not? Do you understand how I'll hate you now after saying all this, for having been here and listening? After all, a man speaks out like this once in a lifetime, and then it is in hysterics. What more do you want? Why, after all, do you still stand there in front of me? Why do you torment me? Why don't you go? But at this point a strange thing happened. I was so accustomed to think and imagine everything from books, and to picture everything in the world to myself just as I had made up in my dreams beforehand, that I could not even take in this strange circumstance all at once. What happened was this. Lisa, wounded and crushed by me, understood a great deal more than I imagined. She understood all this, what a woman understands first of all. If she feels genuine love, that is, that I was myself unhappy. The frightened and wounded expression on her face was followed first by a look of sorrowful perplexity. When I began to call myself a scoundrel and a blackguard, and my tears flowed, that tirade was accompanied throughout by tears. Her whole face worked convulsively. She was on the point of getting up and stopping me. When I finished, she took no notice of my shouting. Why are you here? Why don't you go away? But realizing only that it must have been very bitter to me to say all this. Besides, she was so crushed. Poor girl, she considered herself infinitely beneath me. How could she feel anger or resentment? Suddenly, she leapt up from her chair, and with irresistible impulse she held out her hands, yearning toward me, though still timid and not daring to stir. At this point there was an upheaval in my heart, too. Then she suddenly rushed to me, threw her arms around me, and burst into tears. I, too, could not restrain myself, and sobbed as I never had before. "They won't let me. I can't be good," I managed to say. Then I went to the sofa, fell on it, fell downward, and sobbed on it for 1/4 of an hour in genuine hysterics. She knelt near me, put her arms round me, and stayed motionless in that position. But the trouble was the hysterics could not go on forever, and after all, I am writing this loathsome truth, lying face downward on the sofa with my face thrust into my nasty leather pillow. I began by degrees to be aware of a far-away, involuntary but irresistible feeling that after all, it would be awkward for me to raise my head now and look at Lisa straight in the face. Why was I ashamed? I don't know, but I was ashamed. In my overwrought brain, the thought also occurred that our parts were after all completely reversed now, and she was now the heroine, and I was just a crushed and humiliated creature as she had been before me that night 4 days ago. And after all this came into my mind, during the minutes I was lying face down on the sofa. My God! Surely I was not envious of her then. I don't know. To this day I cannot decide, and at that time, of course, I was still less able to understand than I am feeling now. I cannot get on without domineering and tyrannizing over someone, after all. But after all, there is no explaining anything by reasoning, and consequently it is useless to reason. I conquered myself, however, and raised my head. I had to do so sooner or later. I am convinced to this day that it was just because I was ashamed to look at her that another feeling was suddenly kindled and flamed up in my heart, a feeling of mastery and possession. My eyes gleamed with passion, and I gripped her hands tightly. How I hated her, and how I was drawn to her at that minute. The one feeling intensified the other. I was almost like an act of vengeance. At first there was a look of amazement, even of terror, on her face, but only for one instant. She warmly and rapturously embraced me. That brings us to chapter 10 of part 2 of Dostoyevsky's Notes from Underground. And there we'll leave it for now. Will we leave it there? Will we leave it there for now? You know what? We'll leave off a discussion for the next segment. But no. We carry on. We carry on with chapter 10 of Dostoyevsky's Notes from Underground, part 2. 1/4 of an hour later, I was rushing up and down the room in frenzied impatience. From minute to minute, I went up to the screen and peeped through the crack at Lisa. She was sitting on the floor with her head leaning against the bed and must have been crying. But she did not go away, and that irritated me. This time she understood it all. I had insulted her once and for all, but there's no need to describe it. She realized that my outbursts of passions had been simply revenge, a new humiliation for her, and that to my earlier, almost generalized hatred was added now a personal, envious hatred, though I do not maintain positively that she understood all this distinctly. But she certainly did fully understand that I was a despicable man, and what was worse, incapable of loving her. I know I shall be told that this is incredible, that it is incredible to be as spiteful and stupid as I was. It may be added, it was strange that I would not love her, or at any rate appreciate her love. Why is that strange? In the first place, by then I was incapable of love, for I repeat, for me loving meant tyrannizing and showing my moral superiority. I have never in my life ever been able to imagine any other sort of love, and have nowadays come to the point of sometimes thinking that love really consists in the right, freely given by the beloved objects, to be tyrannized over. Even in my underground dreams, I did not imagine love in any form other as a struggle. I always began it with hatred and ended it with mortal subjugation, and afterwards I could never imagine what to do with a subjugated object. And what is there incredible in that, since it had so succeeded and corrupted myself morally, since I was so out of touch with real life, that I had just thought of reproaching her and putting her to shame for having come to me to hear fine sentiments, and did not even guess that she had come not at all to hear fine sentiments, but to love me, because to a woman true resurrection, true salvation from any sort of ruin, and true moral regeneration is contained in love and can only show itself in that form. I no longer hated her so much, however, when I was running about the room and peeping through the crack in the screen, I was only insufferably oppressed by her being there. I wanted her to disappear. I wanted peace. I wanted to be left alone in my underground world. Real life oppressed me with its novelty so much that I could hardly breathe. But several minutes passed, and she still remained without stirring, as though she were unconscious. I had the shamelessness to tap softly at the screen, and though to remind her, she started, sprang up, and flew to seek her shawl, her hat, her coat, just as though she were making her escape from me. 2 minutes later, she came from behind the screen and looked with heavy eyes at me. I gave a spiteful grin, which was forced, however, to keep up appearances, and I turned away from her look. "Goodbye," she said, going towards the door. I ran up to her, seized her hand, opened it, thrust something in it, and closed it again. Then I turned immediately and hurriedly rushed to the other corner of the room to avoid seeing anyway. I meant to lie a moment ago, to write that I did this accidentally, not knowing what I was doing, though through foolishness, through losing my head, but I don't want to lie. And so I will say straight out that I opened her hand and put the money in it from spite. It came into my head to do so while I was running up and down the room and she was sitting behind the screen. But I can say this for certain, though I did that cruel thing purposely, it was not an impulse from the heart, but came from my evil brain. This cruelty was so affected, so purposely made up, so completely a product of the brain, of books, that I could not even keep it up for a minute. First I rushed to a corner to avoid seeing her, and then in shame and despair rushed after Lisa. I opened the door in the passage and began listening. "Lisa! Lisa!" I cried on the stairs, but in a low voice, not boldly. There was no answer, but it seemed to me I heard her footsteps lower down on the stairs. "Lisa!" I cried more loudly. No answer, but at that moment I heard the stiff outer glass door open heavily with a creak and slam violently. The roar echoed up the stairs. She had gone. I went back to my room in hesitation. I felt horribly oppressed. I stood there at the table, beside the chair on which she had sat, and looked aimlessly before me. A minute passed. Suddenly I started. Straight before me on the table I saw, in short, I saw a crumpled blue 5-ruble note, the one I had thrust into her hand a minute ago. It was the same note. It could be no other. There was no other in the apartment, and so she had managed to fling it from her hand on the table at the moment when I had rushed into the farther corner. So what? I might have expected that she would do that. Might have expected it. No, it was such an egotist. I was so lacking in respect for people in actuality, I could not even imagine she would have done so. I could not endure it. A moment later, I flew like a madman to get dressed, flinging on what I could at random, and ran headlong after her. She could not have gone 200 paces away when I ran out into the street. It was still night, and the snow was coming down in masses and falling almost perpendicularly, blanketing the pavement and the empty street. There was no one in the street. No sound was to be heard. The street lamps gave a disconsolate and useless glimmer. I ran 200 paces to the intersection and stopped short. Where had she gone? And where was I running after her? Why was I running after her? Why? To fall down before her, to sob with remorse, to kiss her feet and beg forgiveness. I longed for that, but my whole heart was being rent to pieces, and never will I recall that minute with indifference. But what for? I thought. Would I not begin to hate her, perhaps even tomorrow, just because I had kissed her feet today? Would I give her happiness? Had I not again recognized that day, for the 100th time, what I was worth? Would I not torment her? I stood in the snow, gazing into the troubled darkness, and pondered this. And will it not be better? Will it not be better? I fantasized afterward at home, stifling the living pang of my heart with fantastic dreams. Will it not be better that she carry the outrage with her forever? Outrage. Why, after all, that is purification. It is the most stinging and painful consciousness. Tomorrow I would have defiled her soul and have exhausted her heart, while now the feeling of humiliation will never die on her. And however loathsome the filth awaiting her, the outrage will elevate and purify her. The hatred, perhaps to forgiveness also. But will all that make things easier for her, though? And indeed, I will at this point ask an idle question, on my own account. Which is better, cheap happiness or exalted suffering? Well, which is better? So I dreamed as I sat at home that evening, almost dead with the pain in my soul. Yet never had I endured such suffering and remorse. But could there possibly have been the faintest doubt when I ran out from my lodging that I would turn back halfway? I never met Lisa again, and I have heard nothing about her. I will add, too, that for a long time afterward I remained pleased with the phrase about the utility of outrage and hatred, in spite of the fact that I almost fell ill from misery. Even now, many years later, I somehow remember all this as very bad. I have many bad memories now, but hadn't I better end my notes here? I believe I made a mistake in beginning to write this story. So it's hardly literature, so much as corrective punishment. After all, to tell long stories, for example, showing off how I have ruined my life by morally rotting in my corner, through lack of fitting environment, through divorce from reality, and vaingloriously spite in my underground world, would certainly not be interesting. A novel needs a hero, and after all, the traits of an anti-hero are expressly gathered together here, and what matters most? It all produces an unpleasant impression, for if we all divorced from life, we are all cripples, every one of us, more or less. We are so far divorced from it that we immediately feel a sort of loathing for actual, real life, and so cannot even stand to be reminded of it. After all, we have reached the point of almost looking at actual, real life as an effort, almost as hard work, and we are all privately agreed that it is better in books. Why do we sometimes fret? Why are we perverse and ask for something else? We don't know why ourselves. It would be worse for us if our capriciousness requests were granted. Come, try. Come give any one of us, for instance, a little more independence. Untie our hands, widen our spheres of our activity, relax our controls, and yes, I assure you, we would immediately beg to be under control again. I know that you will very likely be angry with me for that, and will begin to shout and stamp your feet. Speak for yourself, you will say, and for your miseries in your underground hole, but you don't dare say all of us. Excuse me, gentlemen. After all, I do not mean to justify myself with that all of us. As for what concerns me in particular, I have only, after all, in my life, carried to an extreme what you have not dared to carry halfway, and what's more, you have taken your cowardice for good sense, and have found comfort in deceiving yourselves, so that perhaps, after all, there is more life in me than in you. Look into it more carefully. After all, we don't even know where living exists now, what it is, and what it is called. Leave us alone without books, and we will be lost and in a confusion at once. We will not know what to join, what to cling to, what to love and what to hate, what to respect and to despise. We are even oppressed by being men with real individual body and blood. We are ashamed of it. We think it a disgrace and try to contrive to be some sort of an impossible, generalized man. We are stillborn, and for many years we have not been begotten by living fathers, and that suits us better and better. We are developing a taste for it. Soon we shall somehow strive to be born from an idea. But enough. I don't want to write more from underground. The notes of this paradoxalist do not end here, however. He could not resist and continued them. But it also seems to me that we may stop here. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for entertaining this, Dostoyevsky's short story, Notes from Underground. Thank you for allowing me to present it to you, this work utterly beyond my grasp. And thank you for the hope in there being an audience for works like this. Let's discuss it more in the future. But for now, I think we may part from each other's company from the underground. Thank you. Goodbye.